Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. Iran's foreign minister visits Saudi Arabia for talks over the situation in the region. At least 45 Palestinians have been killed, 130 others injured in Israeli attacks during the last 24 hours. This as heavy fighting leaves 400,000 people trapped in Gaza. And President Biden cancels his trip to Germany as millions of people in Florida are advised to evacuate immediately. A severe weather system, Hurricane Milton, is on track to make landfall. Welcome. The Israeli army said today that operations are ongoing throughout Gaza. And there are reports of intense shelling in and around the north of the enclave, where the towns of Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun and Jabalia are being targeted. Well, yesterday, the IDF issued new evacuation orders, which analysts say suggest that Hamas is regrouping. Well, at least 45 people have died in strikes during the last 24 hours. 400,000 Palestinians are currently trapped in the north. Well, officials say the total number of people killed since Israel launched its war in Gaza has now passed 42,000. Well, for more, we can speak now to Adnan Abu-Hasna, who is a spokesperson for the United Nations Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, who joins us now from Cairo. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. UNRWA, we understand, has been forced to halt services in parts of northern Gaza. I'm just wondering what the latest is that you're hearing about the situation on the ground, specifically in and around the town of Jabalia.
It is horrific. Nearly 400,000, people are fleeing, the area, or still, in Jabalia camp and the Beit Lahia area, as they believe that there is no safe place at all. So they prefer to stay at their shelters, actually, especially in Jabalia camp. Many people are being killed in the last 24 hours, and hundreds have been injured. Also, shelters are being destroyed. Maybe this is the 10th time or 9 times, that the Jabalia camp, people, they are fleeing, or they are being displaced, actually, many times. They don't know where to go. Now, and beside that, we at UNRWA, we closed, 7 shelters, 7 schools that, used to shelter tens of thousands of people. And we have the water wells, we have 8 water wells in Jabalia camp. 6 of them are shut down, now because of the fighting, because of the huge, shelling, actually, that it's not safe at all for UNRWA employees or for ordinary people who are trapped, actually, in that area.
Yeah, we understand that 3 hospitals in northern Gaza have been told to evacuate. And I just want to ask what the reason is for that, and where are the patients supposed to go?
There's no way, actually. Where to go, we don't understand. There's only 1 hospital still functioning in Gaza City. It's functioning about 20% of its capacity. They call it, its name is Al Ahli Hospital, actually, in the middle of Gaza City. But if you look at the health sector in general, in the northern part of Gaza City and in the southern part of Gaza City, the health sector is collapsing. So it's, horrific. We don't know what's going, it's crazy what's going on, now, where to evacuate them. 3 hospitals, most of them, they are actually, damaged. Its capacity is at the low level, they don't function, as before. And you talk about 400,000 people. Now they have no hospitals, no healthy clinics, even the only healthy clinics of UNRWA also shut down. So it's really, the health sector or the health circumstances are, deteriorating, and people are trapped. No services, no water, no health services, no sewage system, nothing at all there.
Yeah, and some of those hospitals, we understand, served an additional role, not just to treat the injured, but they were also being used as shelters by thousands of people, weren't they?
Yes, that's true, actually. And today also, they shelled one of the hospitals, according to the news coming out from Jabalia camp, and many had been killed, in the court of the Yemen, hospitals, and tens of people had been injured because they believe that hospitals, UN schools, UNRWA schools, safe, but actually are not safe. And many had been killed in our shelters or around the shelters or inside hospitals.
It's being said by some analysts and being implied by Israel as well that Hamas is appearing to regroup in some areas. So that means there's no end in sight to the violence, doesn't it?
Look, this is what the Israelis said, actually. But we are looking at the whole picture. We are talking about 400,000 people, The question, how many Hamas, are being there? The conclusion of all what's going on, that innocent people, civilians, they are paying a very heavy price. Most of the people that had been killed in the last 24 hours, they are, elderly people, they are, children and women. It's very simply, they are just people, they want to survive. They don't have, any idea about politics. They don't talk politics. They just people, they stay around there, destroy homes, hoping that there will be a ceasefire. But now they are displacing them, pushing them out of these, destroyed shelters to the nowhere, actually.
Indeed. So, basically, there is no end in sight, is there?
Yes. Actually, people, they are hopeless. They don't know where to go. The lack of services, lack of food, the hunger is deepening, reminding us of the early days when the north of Gaza Strip, we were suffering a lot, and everyone was screaming and crying for food, for help. But now, actually, what's going on, that the Israeli or the IDF, actually, they are evacuating the whole area, pushing 400,000 people out of that area. It is a catastrophe because no one will be able to service or to give, food and to provide health services or water or anything, any kind of services, actually. It is impossible now because the shelling is so heavy. And, people, talking to us I talked to some people there in the northern part of Gaza, and they told me that even at the beginning, of this war after October 7, it was not like that.
And just lastly, the winner of this year's Nobel Peace Prize will be announced tomorrow, we understand. UNRWA is tipped to be one of the hot favourites to be awarded for that Peace Prize. I just wonder what it would mean to you and your team were that to happen.
It means that the international community and the world and everyone is rewarding us for the great work, the humanitarian work, because we are a leading, element. We are a leading, power, so providing people with all kinds of services, psychological support, food, health, water, and everything. And nearly 230 of our colleagues had been killed. And this is the biggest number since the establishment of the UN in 1948. And despite all the difficulties and all the death and all the destruction, we continue to work because we believe in the UN values. We are mandated to do that despite all the evacuation orders, despite all the killing, the shelling, the destruction. We are there, continue to work because we believe in our mission. We believe in the UN values. We believe in the international law. We believe in Geneva Accord. So we are representing the good side of the story, the good side for those who believe in a humanitarian work.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Adnan Abu-Hasna, spokesperson for UNRWA. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
Meanwhile, 2 people were killed today in a rocket attack on the northern Israeli city of Kiryat Shmona, which is near the border with Lebanon. Well, this area of Israel has been the regular target of Hezbollah rocket fire. Well, Israel expanded its military operation into Lebanon in response to these kinds of cross-border attacks by Hezbollah. The Lebanese government, meanwhile, says that more than 1.2 million people have been displaced during these past 2 weeks as a result of Israeli airstrikes. Well, many people have spoken about the situation on the streets of Beirut as they seek refuge in public spaces.
Netanyahu's threat won't make us surrender, and he knows it. There's great steadfastness and the resistance. Hezbollah promised us victory, and we hope for victory. We will never give up.
You cannot say, get rid of Hezbollah. They're Lebanese. Did Hezbollah come from another planet? No. It is a part of the Lebanese social fabric. Hezbollah will recontact the government, and the decision shall be in the hands of the country's officials.
I tell Hezbollah, if you can no longer continue the battle in a proper way, announce your withdrawal and loss. It's not a shame to lose.
Okay, people speaking there on the streets of Beirut. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign minister traveled to Saudi Arabia today for talks regarding the situation in the region. Well, for more on all of this, we can speak now to Hanin Ghadar, who is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy think tank and also an expert on Hezbollah. Thank you so much for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Contrary to what we've heard and all the attacks that have been carried out to degrade Hezbollah, it seems that they're still highly operational, doesn't it?
They are operational, yes, not highly operational. Like they have issues with their military, especially the more advanced missiles, the precision-guided missiles, the long-range missiles. They have been hitting the same areas. They haven't really escalated in the way that we were expecting them to escalate in case of the killing of their Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah or that kind of bombing we're seeing in Lebanon. The response has always been promised to be much bigger than this. What they're doing now is using whatever missiles they still have, and those that they can access, because there are others that they cannot access. The advanced missiles are not easy to launch, so we don't see them using the precision-guided missiles, for example, because they need to be moved, put on trucks, calibrated, and it takes time for them to use this kind of advanced missiles, and Israel will bomb them before they launch them. So they are still capable because they still have some. The problem is that Israel is continuing with its military operations against the rest of their arsenal, and slowly but surely they will not have anything left except the very small weaponry like the guns and the small guns. Mm-hmm. The missiles, what Israel is doing is really destroying their arsenal, mainly all the missiles that could threaten Israel, and it's not going to stop before it finishes its mission and clears, of course, additionally clears the south of Litani. So they still have some because Israel is not done.
Indeed, and as well as targeting their military hardware, the Israeli army has been targeting their chain of command, their leaders. And we heard the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant saying that the man who was supposed to replace or succeed Hassan Nasrallah, and I'm talking here about Hashem Safieddine, has probably been, quote, eliminated. What are your thoughts? Do you think he's still alive?
No, probably not. If he's still alive, we would have heard. If he's still alive and they have a proof of him being alive, they would have confirmed it. They'd rather confirm it than hide it because it's humiliating that he actually was killed. And the fact that they couldn't reach his body, they couldn't get his body because of the magnitude of the strike and the fact that they can't actually reach the site to dig up his body due to the continuous Israeli bombings and threats means that the only reason why we didn't have a confirmation of his death, which is something that Hezbollah usually does for these people, is the fact that they haven't reached his body yet. And I think this is the main issue, like they can't say he's for sure that he's dead, and they can announce his death and hold a funeral until they reach his body. But most probably, yeah, he's gone.
So where does all of this leave Hezbollah's succession planning? If every time they announce someone new to replace Hassan Nasrallah, that person is promptly targeted and killed?
Yeah. I think it's not. They're not going to do that. We heard statements about their, shared decision-making process, which is ridiculous because they need a proper communication system to have a shared decision. They need the proper meeting spaces to have a shared decision. It's not happening. They don't make any decisions today. In the middle of this war, until this war is over, when they can actually start counting their losses and thinking of the future, they are incapable of making these kinds of decisions. And I don't think they're capable of making that kind of decision of succession because the next successor is going to be killed. The problem is that Israel is not waiting for that. They're continuing to kill any potential successor. And I think at one point there will be no one left. And anyone who's left is not going to be qualified to be a leader or even a senior commander. They need time to train and appoint a new class of senior commandants and leaders. And there's no one to do that. So I think what's going to happen if there's a will by the Iranians to rebuild Hezbollah is that the Iranians, the IRGC themselves, will be on the ground with a hands-on approach on training and reorganizing Hezbollah. They will have to be, it will be like more of a Syria scenario where the IRGC will be back in Lebanon on the ground, like the beginning of Hezbollah, but more of a Syria scenario where they have to train themselves and rebuild whatever is left of Hezbollah if they can. Because I'm not sure they can. They would want to, but I'm not sure they can because Israel might actually target them as well. So they're waiting until Israel is done with what they would have to do. They're waiting for the next response, the Israeli response on Iran, to see what that means for them. They're waiting for some kind of diplomatic solution to this war to see if there's anything left of Hezbollah. There are a lot of factors that are going to influence this decision on when and how the IRGC would come to Lebanon to rebuild Hezbollah.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. We're out of time. Hanin Ghadar, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Let's get a brief check of some other stories we're following for you now. The Kremlin denies claims that the former US President Donald Trump has spoken with President Vladimir Putin 7 times since leaving office. Well, those claims were made in a book by the journalist Bob Woodward, which is set to be published later on this month. Well, the book also alleges that Trump secretly sent COVID-19 tests to Putin during the height of the pandemic. Well, the Trump campaign team has described these claims as, quote, the inventions of a madman. Germany's defense ministry is increasing support for Ukraine, with the Bundestag approving an additional 400 million euros in military aid for 2024. Well, the ministry says this funding will allow for 50 projects worth a total of 1.4 billion euros this year. Well, the US has also pledged an extra 8 billion euros in aid for Ukraine. Several US states have sued TikTok, claiming that the app is addictive for children and harms their mental health. Over a dozen states, including New York and California, have filed lawsuits related to the app's impact on teens and young users. Well, in all, 13 states allege that TikTok is designed to encourage compulsive and excessive use, negatively affecting children's mental well-being. We're going to take you to the United States now, where President Joe Biden has been forced to withdraw from what would have been the highest level meeting of Ukrainian donors in Germany. Well, the White House says that the president will have to stay in the US to monitor Hurricane Milton, which is expected to make landfall in Tampa, Florida, later on today. Well, for more, we can speak to our correspondent, Kate Fisher, who joined us now from Washington. Kate, great to have you with us. The US President Joe Biden pulling out of that Ramstein Group conference. It's now been postponed, and I'm assuming that's quite a setback for Ukraine and also for the German hosts.
It really is huge for both of them, particularly, of course, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, who is hoping to gather all these world leaders around to detail his so-called victory plan, which is a strategy aimed at getting Russia to the negotiating table. He was hoping at this meeting to get the US to agree for Ukraine to use long-range weapons, US weapons that could fire more deeply into Russia. And of course, it would have been symbolic to have gathered all these heads of state and for US President Joe Biden to really demonstrate the American support for Ukraine, as we are just a few weeks away from the US election, presidential election, and we don't know who will be in charge next year of the purse strings from the United States. And as for Germany itself as well, a big miss, because a sitting US president has not visited the country since 1985, which was Ronald Reagan who visited Bonn, and this was going to be a big deal. President Biden was going to be given the highest civilian honor in Germany. He would also have met with the French leader Macron and Keir Starmer, the leader of the United Kingdom. So it's a big miss for geopolitically and for kind of US influence on the world stage.
And what would a second Trump administration mean for Ukraine and the funding of its ongoing war with Russia?
Well, I think this is one of the reasons that Volodymyr Zelensky will be so concerned that this meeting has been postponed, because the worry is if Donald Trump becomes the US president, that the money may dry up somewhat. He has made it clear in his campaign rallies that he doesn't believe that the US should be supporting Ukraine with this much military aid. He called Volodymyr Zelensky the greatest salesman of all time, saying that he comes over here and gets $60 billion worth of aid without doing anything. He's also said that if he becomes president, he will solve the war between Ukraine and Russia even before he takes office, while he's still president-elect before the inauguration, and claims that if he had been president when war broke out, it would never have happened in the first place if he'd been in the White House. So it certainly isn't, it certainly would seem that if there is a Trump presidency, that Ukraine will get a lot less support from the United States. And of course, Donald Trump has made no bones about the fact that he doesn't agree with US being such a big part of NATO, which again will affect the defense of Ukraine.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for that update from Washington. Kate Fisher, thank you. Well, staying in the United States, Hurricane Milton is expected to make landfall on Florida's Gulf Coast during the coming hours. The storm has now been downgraded slightly to Category 4, which is still the second highest level. Well, millions of people have been given evacuation orders, and the authorities have issued dire warnings for those who choose to ignore the order. Well, Tampa Bay, which is home to more than 3 million people, could very well be in the eye of that storm when it comes ashore. Well, let's get the latest on this now with Weather Network presenter and storm hunter Mark Robinbson. Mark, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Looks pretty windy where you are. We understand that weather system has been downgraded slightly, but still a very severe weather system, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a meteorologist, it's fascinating to watch storms of this magnitude. But this is a highly populated area of Florida. You're talking about the Tampa region, Sarasota, all the way down to Punta Gorda, all of that big urban area. The winds themselves are starting to pick up. I'm going to step out just a little bit. You might not be able to hear me. I'm going to show you just a little bit of these absolutely deserted streets in the Tampa region. Step back in. There's a good gust right there. But this is just the outer bands. This is not the main part of the storm. When you get to those inner bands, that's when it's going to really take off. That's when the wind is going to really increase. But it's the storm surge that is the real danger and what everybody is quite concerned about here in Florida.
Yeah, I mean, just looking around you there, as you say, not a soul in sight. Car on the road just behind you. And I'm wondering if cars are likely to be washed away if there is storm surges. Just tell us, though, Mark, when can we expect this to make landfall, this weather system?
Well, it's going to likely make landfall as we get into the evening. And we talk about landfall, we're talking about when the eye sort of comes on land. But keep in mind that it's not a point. These storm systems are very, very large. And so you're seeing effects, like, as you can see, you're already starting to see effects already. So the conditions are just going to get worse and worse from now on until that eye makes landfall, likely a little bit south of Tampa, which is actually a very good scenario for Tampa itself, because if it came into the bay, you were going to potentially see 15 feet of storm surge. Now, because the eye is just going to be a little bit south, we're not looking at that much surge coming into the bay. So Tampa may have once again escaped that potential major catastrophe.
Mark, you are, of course, a storm hunter, so this is sort of your line of work, isn't it? I'm just wondering, A, have you ever seen anything like this before? And B, do you not feel like you yourself are in danger there?
Well, I mean, this is Hurricane 28 for me. So the biggest one that I went through it's just on another level, which was Hurricane Katrina in 2005 in Gulfport, just outside of New Orleans. That one was something else. But I think this year though we had Helene just like a little less than a week and a half ago, and I was in that one. For the Weather Network, we're live streaming. We're live stream this one a little later on our YouTube channel. But this one again. What I was very concerned about was that surge into the urban area of Tampa, but it does look like that surge instead is going to come into Sarasota. So I think that's the silver lining. It's the best of a bad situation at this point.
And have people been given enough time to evacuate, do you think? Because not everyone is expected to leave the at-risk areas, are they?
Yeah, I mean the big problem is that some people simply can't. You don't have the money. There's some areas that are poor. People can't necessarily get out very easily. They haven't got $1,000 to have a hotel for a couple of nights. So they, are just sort of holding on where they can. There's a great saying, flee from the water, hide from the wind. The cities and the counties have opened up shelters. People are moving into shelters now. People are sort of making those final preparations. And I'm hoping, my fingers are crossed that everybody that can get out has gotten out just in case. Better to have moved to a shelter and not have surge in your house than the other way around.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, and do stay safe there. Weather Network presenter and storm hunter Mark Robinbson, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Let's get some business news for you now. The US is considering breaking up Google due to accusations of causing harm to Americans. Well, the Department of Justice has been exploring options since an August ruling which found that Google illegally stifled competition in online search. Well, if approved, it could be the largest regulatory action in big tech history. Well, Google has strongly opposed the proposals, warning they could harm consumers, businesses and developers. Shares in 7 and I Holdings, which are the owners of 7-Eleven, rose today after receiving a takeover offer from Canadian rival Alimentation Couche-Tard. Well, 7 and I confirmed the new offer. It did not provide further details. Well, Bloomberg reported that the offer values the company at more than $47 billion. Well, shares closed 4.7% higher in Tokyo after peaking at a 9.5% increase. And Hyundai is going to roll out a $3.3 billion IPO of its India unit next week. Well, this is expected to be the largest stock market debut in India. Well, the price range for the initial public offering has been set at just over $22 per share. Brazil's Supreme Court has lifted its ban on the social media platform X in a row over banning accounts spreading misinformation about the 2022 presidential election. Well, it was announced that X could resume operations in the country after suspending the accounts, paying $5.1 million in fines and appointing a local representative as required by Brazilian law. And some sports news for you just before we go. Novak Djokovic took a step closer to his 100th ATP title with a commanding 6-3, 6-1 win over Romain Safelin at the Shanghai Masters. Well, the 37-year-old Serb, who won his 99th title with Olympic gold in August, is going to face the Czech teenager Jakub Mensik in the quarterfinals. Well, Djokovic aims to join Jimmy Connors and Roger Federer as the only men with 100 tournament victories to their name. Heavyweights Moses Itamu and Johnny Fisher will be on the undercard for Tyson Fury's rematch with Alexander Usyk on the 21st of December in Saudi Arabia. Well, Itamu will face the Australian Dempsey McKean, while Fisher will face fellow Brit Dave Allen. Well, Fury is looking for revenge against Usyk in his bid to become a three-time heavyweight world champion after losing their undisputed match in May. The former Liverpool manager Jurgen Klopp has been named global head of soccer at Red Bull. The 57-year-old German is going to start this new role on the 1st of January 2025. Well, Red Bull stated that Klopp will not handle daily operations, but will provide advice on playing style, transfer strategy, and coaching development. And in tennis news, line judges are going to be eliminated from Wimbledon after 147 years. This as the All England club switches to electronic line calling from next year. Well, the technology will be used for all qualifying and main draw matches, replacing judges who shout out calls like out and fault on serves. Well, the Australian Open and the US Open implemented electronic line calling in 2021 and 2022, respectively. Let's get a reminder of our top stories just before we leave you. The Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia is in Riyadh, where he is discussing the situation in the region. At least 45 Palestinians have been killed, 130 others injured in Israeli attacks during the past 24 hours, as heavy fighting leaves 400,000 people trapped in Gaza. President Biden cancels his trip to Germany as millions of people in Florida are advised to evacuate immediately. A severe weather system, Hurricane Milton, is on track to make landfall. That's all we've got time for. Coming up next is Riz Khan, and at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, do join Rosanna Lockwood for Global News Today. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned if you can.
On this episode of The Riz Khan Show, we mark an unhappy anniversary. 1 year after October the 7th, tens of thousands of Palestinians are dead, hundreds of thousands displaced, while Israelis mourn their own dead and plead for the return of the hostages. We'll look back on the Israel-Gaza war through the eyes of people whose lives have been forever changed. There are plenty of people walking around Washington, D.C. who owe their lives to my next guest. Tariq Haddad is a Palestinian-American who has saved countless patients through his work as a cardiologist. But he's been helpless to save more than 175 members of his own family who have lost their lives during the Israeli military operation in Gaza. He turned down an offer to meet the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken as he considered the 3-minute appointment inadequate to address his outrage. Dr. Haddad and I sat down for a conversation at his home in Virginia. Dr. Haddad, thanks for making the time. I know this is not an easy conversation, but I'm glad you could at least give us the time for it. Let's start by painting a picture of your early life, your experiences of Gaza as a child.
So I thank you for having me. I grew up in Gaza, so from the time I was a few months old. Most of my formative youth, my memories are just the beauty of Gaza, the people, I grew up in my grandmother's home. So my parents moved there when I was 3 months old in Khan Yunis. We lived there among, my very large extended family. The entire street actually is all our family and our extended family. My memories growing up, were several things. Of course, a lot of happiness in terms of, my family, beautiful, beautiful people. Palestinians just are warm, incredibly giving people. But, there's a lot of memories of just living under occupation. And that even as a child, not understanding the history or anything. It was very formative in my life. Just growing up with very little water, very little electricity. If I took a long shower, there wasn't enough water for everybody else to cook with. So memories like that. Lots of violence, growing up under violence. It's just a fact of life as a Palestinian.
Which also is one of the reasons there are such big extended families. Everyone's quite closely bonded under those circumstances, aren't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's, there's no family member who has not been affected in some way, shape, or form by violence. Every one of my cousins has either been, jailed, been hit, been affected in some way by the Israeli occupation. I myself was shot at multiple times by rubber bullets playing chess in the street with my cousins. This was when I was around 13 years old. It's just a fact of life, and like you said, family and the bond of family among Palestinians is what kind of keeps you together under these very, very trying circumstances.
How did your journey take you from Gaza to Virginia here in the USA, where you're just like 20 minutes from the White House and the State Department?
So, Palestinians, one of the things people don't know a lot about Palestinians is because so much of our life is controlled by others. The occupation, having, food and water and electricity and everything around you, your laws, everything is controlled. And so one of the only things that we have control over to the best of our ability is education. And it's a huge value among Palestinians on education. And so, my parents always, really made that incumbent upon us. And I thankfully, thanks to my parents, had a wonderful education. I was able to eventually come to the United States for my high school years, and then went to Duke University for college. Went on to medical school and my medical training thereafter in the United States.
How easy was it to stay in touch with your extended family once you were based here in the U.S.?
It was extremely difficult. So I tried, before I started my medical training, I would go back as much as I could every summer whenever I was able to. The problem is that because of the, once it got to around 2005, 2006, and the Israeli blockade on Gaza started, the border with Gaza was closed, was only open on average 4 days a month. And so when when somebody's in their medical training and, it was very difficult to be able to go back there and knowing I could get essentially, trapped in there for months on end. So it was very difficult. But we still, my family is always in my minds, and we talk all the time, all my family over there, so.
As you and I sit here, today is actually the anniversary of the Hamas attacks of October the 7th, 2023. What do you recall of hearing about that when it happened? And what went through your head as an American, as a Palestinian, as a doctor?
I think it was a difficult day. I believe, and every Palestinian I know believes, that every human life is valuable, and it doesn't matter. I don't put any credence to any difference among people, among religion. It's all equal, and any loss of human life, innocent life, is a tragedy to me. Both the loss of innocent lives on October 7th, and of course the 45,000 Palestinians who've been killed since, and all the thousands and thousands of Palestinians that have been killed before that. It's all, to me, unnecessary and tragic, in my opinion.
Certainly in the Western narrative, discussing that attack in a very diverse way has become difficult. And it's described as the next Holocaust and so on. But you as a Palestinian, when you heard about the extent of this attack by Hamas and the other groups that joined them, what went through your head? Was it kind of inevitable?
I don't ascribe to any loss of innocent civilians as being inevitable. Having said that, seeing the incredible suffering the Palestinian people have gone through from the time I was born and in the early 70s until now, And even before that, I mean, for 75 years, and then seeing the incredible suffering my family has been under, even during the blockade. I mean, since the mid-2000s, they've lived on average with 4 hours of electricity a day. They've lived with, water that's literally under the WHO, World Health Organization, minimum standards for what people should have. They've lived under, inability to go in and out, to go places, incredible conditions that restricted any freedom of movement, any freedom, any ability to live. And I think, people living under those circumstances, under desperation, with, rates of poverty exceeding any in the world, for the most part, there's going to be desperation. There's going to be desperation, and I think, sadly, I think violence gets bred out of that sort of situation. Because Palestinians have been living under this violence for 75 years, and it's very sad. The whole thing is sad, but I think you have to understand it within the context of all the incredible violence that Palestinians have lived under for so many years.
When it happened, what thoughts did you have about the possible repercussions it would have on your family, the risks it presented?
Oh, I knew immediately. I've dealt with collective punishment in my family for years. The year my youngest son was born, 10 of my family members were killed, including small children, in 2014. And this was Israeli attacks on Gaza, and these were little children who were running in the street. So I've lived with this for years, and I knew this would lead to a lot of death of civilians, and I knew right away. I don't think I had any idea the tragic lengths to which it went, and the way that it affected my family and the family of every person in Gaza.
When you heard about the attack a year ago, then when did you then start to hear about what was happening to your family members? When the losses started from that?
Oh, it's within a few days. The attack started almost immediately, and I would say by mid-October, we were starting to see casualties in my family, and deaths, and homes being destroyed, and then they just really started to mount. And most of my family on my mom's side is in Khan Yunis. Most of my family on my father's side is in Gaza. So they were getting it on both sides. And it's, at this point, we've almost lost track of how many deaths in my family, but it's been well over, at this point, 175 people in my family who've been killed. And it's just been a steady stream. It started in mid-October, and it hasn't stopped since.
Dr. Haddad, one of the problems with discussing the numbers of people killed, the statistic, is that it starts to cloud what are the actual individual stories, the people, the human beings behind those numbers. And that's obviously now evident more so than ever with you and your story. So let's talk about the members of the families that you've lost. And I know it's a difficult conversation, but tell me about some of them. So, who they were and what happened.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, the past year has been a collective nightmare for my family. There's too many to list, and that's the sad part. But just some of the stories that come to mind, just dozens and dozens of children. There's an infant, Sabir, who died in December in the middle of the tents in Rafah after his house had been destroyed, and he died after his father had been killed, all of his siblings had been killed. And his mother had been killed. He was orphaned, and he died from hypothermia in the middle of December. A child who was literally a few days old, and he died from hypothermia, completely unnecessary, having had his home destroyed and all of his family destroyed. Another child from my mom's side of the family, Hamza, who he and his parents and his uncle and aunt and his other uncle and his grandparents all lived in one home. One Israeli missile attack in Khan Yunis on October 25th killed 16 members of his family. Hamza was barely 10 years old, okay, and he survived. He's the only one of his family. He survived. He woke up in a hospital with an amputation, and with the news that his parents, his uncle, his aunt, his other uncle, his grandparents, every single member of his family had been killed. And then he himself succumbed to the trauma from his amputation. I just wish I wish your listeners could understand what it would be like. You know, just take Palestinian or Israeli out of this and just imagine if you were a 10-year-old kid, every single member of your family has been killed, and you wake up in a hospital with an amputation for no reason. You're a child. Another family member of mine from my mother's side of the family, Tuqa, who was killed on her wedding day. Imagine being killed on your wedding day. She was killed with 9 other members of her family on the day of her wedding. Another cousin of mine, Dan Al-Farah, who was killed while she was pregnant. Another was killed on the day she got her PhD while she was sheltering in Rafah. My first cousin from my father's side, Hani, was killed with his mother. He survived initially to find his mother buried from the waist up in the rubble of their home, dead, along with his brother. He managed to survive with a fairly minor leg injury and bled to death the next day because there was no hospitals near his home. In Gaza, every hospital had been destroyed. He died from a completely preventable wound. I mean, the stories go on, and they just continue month after month. Just recently in August, one of my cousins, Abdullah, was going to get bread for his family. His family was hungry. He just went in Khan Yunis just to wherever he could get bread. He had one bag of bread in each of his hands, and he was walking back to his home, and an Israeli missile hit him and killed him. And our last picture of him was him dead on the side of the road with a bag of bread in each hand. Just recently, about 4 or 5 days ago, another large segment of my mother's side of the family, 23 family members, all killed in a strike that was massive, absolutely destroyed. I think I provided you some video, but it's destroyed literally what looks like the equivalent of a New York City block. And it was 9 stories, and numerous families all killed, 23 members of my family. So yeah, numbers don't really tell the story. It's all these human stories. These are all innocent people. These are all members of my family that either I know or my uncles or my aunts know. They're beautiful people, pharmacists, physicians, children, PhD candidates, brides on their wedding day, interior decorators, a journalist, stories. I mean, these are people like any of us. And sadly, I feel like one of the things as a Palestinian we've learned this year is how much we are dehumanized. We're not really looked at as people, just numbers. And I think their stories need to be heard.
That missile attack to which you just referred actually happened very recently.
Yes.
And it means that you're having to keep a toll, and that toll just continues.
Yeah.
How do you cope with that?
It's incredibly difficult. We keep a record of it to honor them because they are beautiful people, and I don't want them to have died in vain. And it's, and I believe we owe it to them. But yes, it has a toll. And, my uncle, we do a lot of different projects to help over there. And, one of my uncles does a beautiful thing. He literally keeps track of every single family member who needs something. And it's a list that's, it goes on, and he literally physically writes down every single family he's given supplies to, food to, something to, because we need to honor people. We need to do what we can under incredibly difficult circumstances.
You work as a cardiologist. You save the lives of people, irrespective of race, religion, color, or anything. And you've still been powerless to be able to help your family in any way over there in Gaza. How has what you've witnessed and how you are still witnessing, or what you're still witnessing, how has that affected your own personal relationship with, what is the value of life, your relationship with life and death?
It's difficult. I mean, like you said, as a physician, I treat everybody equally. I always have, always will. The lack of respect for basic human life that's happened over the past year, it really makes it difficult as a physician. And it's really hard when, so much, as a cardiologist who works on prevention, I talk so much about what you can do to prevent something as opposed to just treating it on the back end. And so much of what's happening is preventable. And it's extremely difficult. When I have to hear statistics like 4 hours of water a day, or 4 hours of electricity a day, when I have to hear things like water that's below the WHO minimum, when I have to hear that, most medications, there's not enough supply for essential medications in Gaza. That's the vast majority. When I have to hear things like, the vast majority of children in Gaza suffer from PTSD, that the most common complaint that brings on PTSD in them is the sound of missile fire. I mean, can you imagine, knowing as a physician all the stuff that's preventable? My own cousin, who's now in the United States, to this day, it is very hard for us to go to a fireworks show because he grew up in Gaza when he was a child. And every time he hears fireworks, it makes him wince because he grew up in the only thing he remembers about that sound is bombs.
As a Palestinian American living in the USA, how do you react and how do you feel when the US continues to reaffirm its support for Israel, its continued supplying of weapons to Israel that is actually responsible for the deaths that your family and thousands, tens of thousands of others are enduring?
It's extremely, extremely difficult. I don't necessarily, delve into the political world, but when we as a country, when our tax dollars, when money that, citizens are working for, and that money is going directly, not to a country, it's not about whether it's going to a country or not, but it's going directly towards the killing of over 45,000 people, directly. I mean, imagine if you were in my shoes and every single time you heard about a family member being killed. And I quite literally have family on the ground telling me, yep, U.S. bombs. We can see the jets, we can see the bombs, we can see exactly what's happening. And I know that that's quite literally, money coming out of my pocket, that's going towards these weapons. It's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult.
So what goes through your head when you hear Israel and the US backing its perspective that it's targeting Hamas fighters who are hiding using civilians as human shields?
Well, since I know most of the family of my family that have been killed, and I know the circumstances, and I quite literally have the videos showing what's happening, and I know these beautiful people, I'm incredulous. That's the only way I can say it. You explain to me how children, getting bags of bread, in the street with nobody around them represents a human shield. You tell me how, a family of mine of 16 people, 3 generations, all living in one home, and beautiful people, including somebody on their wedding day. How in God's name is that representing a human shield? How is a child, who freezes to death as an infant, a human shield? It's very difficult for me to hear these things when the facts on the ground that I'm seeing as a human being, not in the press, but as somebody who has family there. It's very, very difficult to swallow and to grasp this.
You were among a group of Palestinian Americans invited by the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to go to the State Department, just 8 miles from you here, to go and have a discussion with them. And you declined. Now, some would say that was the perfect opportunity to express your anger, to express your frustration. What made you decide not to go?
So I think the context of what happened, so this was in early February, so the context I think is important. So at that time, the United States at that time, under the leadership of both President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken, had already, sent billions of dollars in aid and released weapons from our strategic military reserve in the Middle East directly towards these attacks and towards the killing of my own family. And literally just a couple of days before this meeting was supposed to happen and this invitation happened, the United States had also decided to withdraw aid from the only major organization that's supplying any aid to the Palestinians in Gaza, which was the United Nations Relief and Work Agency.
UNRWA, yeah.
And so I get this invitation. We want a roundtable, and with Palestinian leaders, and actions speak louder than words. And I found it very hard to believe that anything other than political grandstanding was to be accomplished by meeting with the Secretary of State, when every single action on the ground that he had shown was that he had absolutely no regard for Palestinian life. Zero. And I just wasn't going to be, part of a group that was going to be used for political grandstanding. If you want to show that you value all human life, regardless of religion, regardless of ethnicity, I'll be happy to meet with you and talk to you about my views. But if you can't even bring yourself to recognize the importance of all human life, I'm not going to be used for political grandstanding.
So you wrote a 12-page letter that I understand was read out to Antony Blinken.
Yes.
And I know it was quite moving in many places. I'm wondering if you could just actually read out some of that statement to me so we get a sense of it, please.
Sure, yeah, no problem. This was read specifically to Antony Blinken at this round table, and I had a staffer actually print it out for him. So this was the portion that I had read to Secretary of State Blinken. Thank you for the invitation to the roundtable scheduled for today on the Gaza genocide. While I initially submitted an RSVP to attend later today, after a lot of soul searching, I've decided that I cannot in good conscience meet with you today, knowing this administration. How does one meet for what I was told would be 3 minutes with a person you hold responsible for not just the killing of your child, but rather the murder of over 80 of your family members? How do I say in 3 minutes to somebody who will forever in history be known for actively aiding and abetting one of the worst genocides in a century, what that person's actions have done, my family's suffering and that of my people? How do I look a person in the eyes for 3 minutes who not only could have prevented the death of my 85 family members and the nearly 15,000 children in Gaza who have been killed, but actively contributed to their suffering and death by providing military ammunitions from our U.S. military supply to kill my family and destroy their homes? How do I look you in the eyes knowing you couldn't even do the basic minimum, like calling for a ceasefire to end the suffering and the carnage, and even worse, are cutting off humanitarian assistance to 2 million people going through a famine of historic proportions? My family are subsisting on animal feed, Secretary Blinken, because of your policies.
And of course, the death toll has gone up since then.
Yes.
Did you get any feedback, any response from Secretary Blinken?
I was told by people, the staffer who was there, and some people that he stayed cold-faced the entire time as this letter was read to him. No response, and I did not get a personal response either.
As an American voter, do you have any interest in supporting any of the candidates or any of the governments with the way things are going for the U.S. election now?
I mean, right now, the person that I'm probably going to vote for is Jill Stein. I have no ability to vote, for a government right now that, as I said, actions speak louder than words. I cannot ethically as a person, not just as a Palestinian, but as a human being, I cannot support a government that has no problem donating and giving tens of billions of dollars towards the death of innocent children. I just can't do that. If you don't have the ethics to understand that that's wrong, it speaks to me about your ability to lead, and I cannot in good conscience, vote for the Democrats. They need to understand that this issue is a red line for a lot of people, and it's not just for Palestinians. It's anybody who cares about human life, who cares about decency and equality.
On that note, Washington, D.C. has seen a number of pro-Palestinian protests, and yet I also see, for example, Israeli flags in windows around your neighborhood. And I wonder, how do you feel when you see these? How do you now regard America, the country you call home?
I don't think it's shaken my faith in there are a lot of good people, and a lot of people who've understandably really put their careers on the line, their lives on the line for what's right. And I'm part of some very inspirational organizations that are multi-ethnic, multi-religious, incredibly meaningful ones that people who have nothing to do with the Palestinian, story, and they absolutely advocate. Some of the most vociferous supporters that I work with, are people of the Jewish faith. And it's and it's very inspirational. As far as I haven't lost. I'm generally an optimistic person. Yes, this past year has been very difficult, but I think just as much as I've seen the ugliness come out, I've also seen the beauty and the people, the courage in people to support what's right.
What a lot of people have seen or consider as ugly is how those protesting for the Palestinian people have been treated by the governments, the militaries, the authorities. Tell me about your daughter Serene, who herself was trying to, now reached an age, late teens, as a young woman, trying to express her voice at a protest. What happened? Tell me.
So my daughter Serene has been really an inspiration for a lot of people. When she's in college, she's been trying to lead a lot of peaceful movements to bring light to the tragedies affecting her family, her own family. It's not just the Palestinian people. And she's done a lot of brilliant things at her university, and she one of the things she tried to do was to have a peaceful protest, and it was very she was a leader of this protest at her university. She organized it. She talked about very specific targeted goals, and she said that we were having this peaceful protest to specifically ask my university to, number one, to disclose what funds our university is using that supports in any way the killing of Palestinian civilians and the occupation of the Palestinian people. She asked for them to divest from those companies if that's the case, because it's unethical for the university to be supporting companies that support violence and the killing of innocent people. She asked for the university to specifically call for a ceasefire. Very specific issues. She had a multi-ethnic, multicultural protest. People from all over the university. They were not just Palestinian. They were, people of all faiths, all religions, and they had this protest, and it went on all day. And I actually have video footage of this entire thing. They were dancing together, bringing signs. Very, very peaceful protest. And unfortunately, the governor of Virginia. Released an edict and told the police that they needed to crack down as quickly as possible on these protests. And around 8 or 9 p.m., it's pretty, remarkable. It's something out of a movie. If you watch this video, police come up in these large vans with riot gear, tear gas. They lined up and essentially just, plowed through these protesters. And tear gassed them. My own daughter got punched in the face on video. She had to go to the emergency room. She was literally just standing her ground along with the other protesters, trying to just continue to raise awareness to the tragedy and the plight of the Palestinian people. And this was what resulted of it. Multiple protesters, not her, but multiple protesters that she worked with, ended up getting arrested, and were having to defend themselves over a peaceful protest. So it's been very difficult. It's affected us on multiple levels.
So, Dr. Haddad, your daughter Serene, who was punched at that peaceful protest by the police, is one of 5 children you have, ranging from early 20s to early teens. And I wonder how you manage their understanding of the situation, their expectations, how they can move forward knowing what's been going on and considering the loss.
I always try to instill in them in a sense of, number one, I make it very clear to them that, this is about curing the injustice and equality for all people. I think it's very difficult for them when they see every day the injustice that's incurred by people, by Palestinians, both in their family in Gaza and also here. I mean, every one of them has encountered this in one way, shape, or form. The bullying in school for being Palestinian, my daughter, of course, my youngest son, it happens to all of them. And I think what we try to instill in them is a sense that, just advocate for what you know is right, and everything else will take care of itself. Don't sink to other people's level. just, build collaborations with people who truly mean well and who also believe in equality for all people and justice for all people. And everything will work out, but you have to be positive, and you have to try to advocate for the equality. You can't just sit by actively, passively, and just expect everything to get better.
As we reflect on the anniversary of October the 7th, 2023, since the attacks on Hamas, I should say I spoke also to an Israeli man, a relatively young man, whose brother attended the Nova Music Festival, which was attacked. And he was abducted after seeing his wife killed. The shelter in which they hid was sprayed with bullets and a grenade was thrown in. Their 3-year-old son is now being looked after their grandparents. And while he hates the people he holds responsible, it was interesting to hear him saying that he still hopes of living in peace with Palestinian people. And despite the unimaginable horrors that you and your family have held, what's your view on that? Do you see any kind of common bond between the innocent people on both sides who've been affected by this conflict?
I absolutely do. And the reason I do is because you see it every day. You see the collaboration between well-meaning people of the Jewish faith and Israelis and Palestinians and people who, and it happens every day. And you see this collaboration. I think there's a humanness in all of us that bonds us together. And I think, I can stand here and say that I can feel and empathize with the suffering of anybody. It doesn't matter. I don't represent just the Palestinian people. I think, the suffering of anybody, Israeli or Palestinian, is unnecessary. The problem here is that we don't recognize the big elephant in the room, which is, if you don't treat the injustice that's been happening for 75 years, the inequality, the apartheid, the unequal military laws and the unequal, ability to have access to water and food and all those things, you can't have that. Show me anywhere in the world in history where you've had this level of injustice and apartheid and there be peace, but I am, to answer your question, very optimistic because of the collaboration I already see. I can recount, to the story you mentioned about October 7th, somebody I know very well and I respect, Miko Peled, who's an Israeli, who's the son of an Israeli general. And, he had a person in his family, tragically, who was killed in a suicide bombing. And this was back, a couple of decades ago now. And his response to that, rather than turning to hatred, was to actually ask the right question, which was to say, what level of desperation have we caused the Palestinian people that somebody would be willing to lose their life, and kill somebody else because they've gotten to that level of desperation, and that led him to the Palestinian cause, and he's one of the most inspiring leaders now, trying to advocate for equality for Palestinians and Israelis.
Is it difficult, especially for your family in Gaza, not to hate the Israelis?
One of the things that just honestly moves me to tears every time I think about it is just how inspirational the people in Gaza are. Because there's a Palestinian term that we use called sumud, which means, resilience in the face of oppression. And, they show it every day. And what I mean by that is nothing gets them down. The circumstances they live under anywhere else in the world, if you erase the term Palestinian, you ask people to live under the conditions they live under, I don't think very few people in this world could live the way that they live. 4 hours of electricity, barely enough water to do anything, days without regular food, inability to leave an area the size of a very, very small U.S. state, your whole childhood, and yet they live. They live, and they not just live. They refuse to be disappointed or let down. They try to live, and they try to have their kids live. There is so little hatred in the people that I know and all my family. I don't think the term, the other side really comes up. They of course focus on the injustice, but they try their best to live through it, and they're unflappable. It makes everything we go through in the United States just seem like nothing compared to what they go through. It's inspirational.
And now the situation is such that more than 70% of the buildings to date in Gaza have been destroyed, reduced to rubble. The supplies and conditions are even worse than ever. What does your family have to look forward to if and when the conflict stops?
So, I mean, among my family, all my extended family, there's not a single person whose home is still up and intact. My family home that I grew up in, that I mentioned to you earlier, is completely destroyed. We have albums dating back to the Ottoman Empire. I used to spend hours going through these albums with all my family, and they've all been burned, they've all been destroyed. The house is down in rubble. Every single family member is living somewhere else, whether it's in a tent, or somebody's home. There's not a single person who has any regular place to live. Having said that, again, the Samud that I mentioned, people, they love their land, they love their people, they love that where they live, and they love everything about it. And it's not the physical, it's the emotional. And I think they will rebuild, and I have no doubt in my mind they will rebuild, and they will be even stronger, because that's just the kind of people that we are.
There are those who believe that Israel's goal is to shift everyone out of Gaza, that they have ambitions on the territory. Would your family ever consider leaving?
I don't think so. I mean, most of my family would never, leave permanently. They adore and love their land way too much.
Even if and when this ceasefire does take place, there is no turning the clock back, considering what has happened. How do you move forward emotionally, psychologically now, and get to the next phase past all this? Is it possible even?
I think that the way to get past it is the ceasefire is like sort of, peanuts compared to the underlying issues. Nothing will get better until the blockade on Gaza is over, and people can actually get, you have to remember that the water and the electricity was all controlled by the Israeli authorities. So it's not like we have any access to it without it's shut off, shut on. And so, the conditions that lead to the injustice have to improve. Water has to be allowed in. Electricity has to be allowed in. People in all of Palestine, in all of the Palestinian territories, in the West Bank and Gaza, they have to be allowed to live as equal citizens, equal people. And until that happens, none of this will get better. You have hundreds and hundreds of people in the West Bank getting killed. What does that have to do with Gaza? Why are they getting killed? Why are settlers killing Palestinian civilians in the West Bank? It's part of the overall, occupation, the apartheid, the injustice. And that to answer your question, that's what has to be fought by the international community. In this day and age, it is unacceptable in the international community in this day and age, in 2024, for the world to support an apartheid system. And it's just not acceptable. And I think when the world wakes up to that, this will get better.
Dr. Tariq Haddad, thank you for taking the time to tell your story.
Thank you.
Thank you. Almog Levy celebrated his third birthday with his family this summer, although celebrated is actually not the best word to describe the occasion. As so often since October the 7th, he asked where his mum and dad were, and he asked when they would be coming home. But on that fateful day last October, his mother, Anyav, was killed and his father, Or, taken hostage by Hamas gunmen as they hid in a shelter at the Supernova Music Festival. Almog's uncle Michael has committed his life to securing the release of his younger brother, Or, and he joins me now in Washington.
Michael, thank you for making the time. Now, I'd like to talk about your nephew, Almog, or Mogi as he's known, in just a little while. But tell me first about his parents, your brother Or. Paint a picture of them for me.
I guess you can call them the perfect couple. They used to be the perfect couple. They met about 15 years ago. At first, they were very good friends, part of the same group of friends. Einav even had a different boyfriend when they met. And then they became friends, and they started hanging out together all the time. And after a while, we all knew that it's about to happen. My mother actually asked him, "Oh, why don't you date enough?" And he just told her, "No, I can't date enough. She's like my sister." And then a few months after, they started dating, and from that day on, they were never apart. They loved traveling, they loved music festival. It was kind of like the new Israeli dream.
And that's the interesting thing. You've always described them as soulmates. You said that you have like or soulmates.
Exactly. I mean, she was his whole life. They did everything together. They went to music festivals together. They traveled the world together. They were never apart, like I said.
Having known each other that long and being so close, what was it like when little Moggy came along and suddenly they were parents?
At first we thought it will change things, but they actually did the same things just with him this time. They flew everywhere with him. They were, I think, like a few months before October 7th, they went to Thailand with him. And they had a lot of fun together.
So before that fateful day, October the 7th, it literally was all flowing very, very nicely then.
Yeah, it was like a dream, I think.
Then, of course, everything changed the next day. They'd headed to that Supernova Music Festival. And as with many things in life, timing can prove to be, quite tragic. How did the events, from what you know of everything, how did the events unfold for Enyav and Or?
They actually got to the Supernova Festival at 6:20 a.m. It was 9 minutes before the attack started. And from what I know, they immediately ran from the area. They all actually texted my mother that they are heading back. But from what I know now, they wanted to turn left, which is the way to their home. But the road was closed, so they had to turn right and drive south. Then they had to run into a bomb shelter because of the missile attack. And from that second on, everything went crazy. They got into this bomb shelter, squeezed in together with 27 others. I'm not sure if you saw those bomb shelters, but it's basically a bus stop made out of concrete with not even a door. It's a tiny one. From inside, I called my mother. It was 7:39 a.m. Completely terrified. He just repeated the sentence, "Mom, you don't want to know what's going on here." And 10 minutes after, the terrorists arrived to that bomb shelter and sprayed it with bullets, with grenades. They even fired an RPG into it. And he had to watch Einav being murdered in front of him, together with 17 others, before he was abducted.
It's hard to imagine how chaotic things were. How long did it take you to find out, you and your family, to find out exactly what had happened to them?
It took us a while. At first, I wasn't too worried because, unfortunately, in Israel, we are used to those missile attacks. So I kept telling myself, okay, they will be fine. It's just a missile attack. They will hide in a bomb shelter and then head back. And my mother actually called me it was around 8:30 or so. And she was crying. She told me that she was worried and she doesn't know what happened and that doesn't answer the phone. I was actually angry. I told her, "Mom, you're just thinking bad things. We'll stop thinking about the worst because the lines probably fell or something like that, and you will call us very soon." And only at 10:15, I got a call from my uncle. He asked me if I know what happened to all or if we heard something from him. And I told him that they should be on their way back, but I'm not sure. That second on, I knew that something really bad happened.
It sounds like, you're so used to that, living in that way, that you tend to remain optimistic, which is interesting.
I think that's kind of how I try to see everything. I try to be as optimistic as possible because you have too many reasons to be pessimistic in Israel.
Well, seeing that video of the attack on that shelter and Or's capture must have been pretty difficult, obviously. But you want the world to see that video. Why is that? Why do you want it to be so public?
It took us a while to decide we want to release it and to show it to the world. But the way I see it is that sometimes the world need a reminder. People need a reminder that there are actually live hostages in Gaza. And I know it's really easy to forget about them, but it's about them. It's not about politics or the war or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's about human beings.
It's very difficult to imagine what this last year would have been like for you. I mean, it's gone on way longer than most people could have imagined. And I'm wondering, emotionally, how trapped you feel in that moment because things haven't moved on after so long.
So I keep saying that people ask me, what are you going to do on October 7th? Or how do you intend to mention it? For me, it's just another day because I still live in October 7th, 2023. Things were stuck there for me. Everything feels like one long day.
Have you become a community with other family members of the hostages? I mean, how does that help you cope? Obviously, if you do get together, it's a support structure. How have you found that coming together?
That's actually one of the positive things that happened because of it. They became my family. I can talk to them. They understand me with no words sometimes. And it's helping.
And yet, the difficulty is that all of you, the families of those waiting, you've had to deal with news. Either you hope for news of release or you have the tragic news, as was the case with the bodies that were found.
Yeah, it's terrible. Sometimes when they are getting released, it's happiest day you can imagine. And sometimes when we hear horrible news like the 6 that were executed, that's the most horrific news you can think of. So in a way, it's like an emotional roller coaster. But the amazing thing is that we stay together. Even the families that got the worst announcement stayed with us, and they keep fighting with us. And that's amazing to see.
Conflicts, they have tragedy on both sides quite often. And as you try to cope, and you and the families of the hostages try to cope with the situation on your side, how easy or difficult is it for you to see what's happening on the other side? That, the suffering obviously some of the Palestinians are going through, many Palestinians are going through.
I hate to see anyone suffer, and I keep saying it everywhere, that Hamas didn't just do it to us as Israelis. They did it to his own people. The Palestinians are suffering because of Hamas. And the fact that Hamas is still there means that everyone will keep suffering. And like I said, I hate to see anyone suffer. And I would love to live in peace together with Palestinians, if possible. And the only way to do it is to release the hostages, and this will end the war. And that's what I think that the world should do. Push towards this.
One of the issues, Michael, is that often a conflict like this just gets seen through the political lens. And I wonder, when you see it being pushed into that political lens, how you worry about the other aspects. I mean, for you, how much is it political?
For me, it's not related to politics in any way. Obviously, I'm not naive. I know the solution has to be to politics somehow, but people has to remember that those are human beings. All is a real human being. The rest of the hostages are real human beings with families and hopes and dreams and plans for the future, just like you and I. And And although it's very easy to take it into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's not about it. It's about human lives. It's about people who just wanted to go and celebrate in a music festival, and people who were kidnapped from their beds. This is not war. They didn't want to fight anyone. We all want to live in peace. Most of the hostages are actually peace activists. I want to live in peace with the Palestinians. I don't hate anyone. I just need my brother back and the rest of the hostages back, and hopefully we can find a way to live together and in peace.
And you've advocated tirelessly for the release of the hostages, including your brother, and you reached out to some fairly prominent people. What's been the response? Who have you reached out to, and how have they responded?
Sometimes I don't even remember because I've met so many influential people, but just to name a few, I've met the Pope, I've met presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers of any country you can imagine. The response is usually very sympathetic. They show solidarity. Sometimes they even do things behind the scenes or publicly. Honestly, I don't care as long as they are doing something to help and to end the suffering for both sides. I'm fine with it. If they can help me get my brother and the rest of the hostages back, I'm fine with any kind of response from them.
Do you worry to some degree that perhaps all these people you are meeting, that the politicians are so wrapped up with their own stuff that you're being paid a lot of lip service, that more could be done?
The fact that they are still there means that we all can do more. You know, me personally, the politicians, the media, all of us. So yeah, sometimes I meet people and I know that nothing is going to come up out of it, but I just keep doing it because you never know who will be the one who will make the change or be able to help.
We're talking here in Washington, D.C., the heart of U.S. politics. And I wondered whether you feel that the U.S. policy on the Israel-Gaza conflict is helping or hindering the situation when it comes to releasing the hostages.
Honestly, I don't know what's the right way. Not I don't know what other families should do. I don't know what politicians should do. I try to wake up every morning and tell myself, I ask myself what I should do now. For me, the fact that the hostages are on the agenda means that the world haven't forgotten. And like I said earlier, the only way to solve the issues in the Middle East starts with releasing the hostages. Everything else will happen only when they are released. So this is what I want, and this is what we are calling for.
It feels kind of frozen to you then, the way things are.
I guess. I mean, we don't hear anything about negotiations right now, so it is, but we'll change it.
Now, I understand you've been disappointed by the fact that some of the human rights organizations that are out there haven't been able to help you. Explain to me what happened with that.
In short, nothing. They didn't meet the hostages. They didn't pass medicine. They didn't even meet them. We expected a lot more. We expected them to at least see them and make sure that they are treated. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. I'm talking about all of them. The Red Cross, all the organizations of the UN, none of them did anything.
Is it possible that perhaps they don't have the ability or access because of the way the conflict has been going? I mean, is the military action, for example, in Gaza perhaps even hindering the chance for them to do that?
I don't believe so, because they have connections. They have people inside Gaza. And from the discussions we had, for example, with the Red Cross, they prefer to preserve the connections with Hamas and not to hurt them. And in a way, they give up on seeing what's going on with the hostages in order to keep those connections with Hamas.
Now, it's interesting because you're saying that that connection that they want with Hamas, you're also saying, and you have said, that Hamas has to go. And in the aftermath of October the 7th, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu actually even said he was determined to wipe out Hamas. Now, I wonder, do you feel you fully understand that? I mean, do you fully understand and support that approach, or do you think it might actually be a hindrance to progressing the release of the hostages?
Oh, I think that the way or the order of things should be the opposite. You know, if you ask any normal human being on the street, they understand that Hamas is a terror organization. They didn't just murder Israelis. They murdered Muslims. They murdered a Muslim guy outside of my brother's bomb shelter because he tried to save the others. He spoke to them in Arabic. He told them he was religious, and they just abused him and executed him, basically. So they have to go in order for the Palestinians to have a chance for normal life. They have to go, but we can get the hostages first and then finish the job with Hamas and make them go for the sake of everyone in the Middle East.
That's what I was wondering, is whether it's a case of the Prime Minister of Israel, you know, continuing with this military action at the cost of the hostages.
I don't see it the same way, because unfortunately, we have experience with hostages in Gaza for more than 10 years now, with no military action. They didn't come back. The Hamas didn't want to negotiate anything about them. So they have to feel some kind of a military pressure. But yes, I agree that after a certain point, Israel has to get to a deal. And that's what we're calling for.
I'm wondering, when you saw thousands of people coming out on the streets and demanding a ceasefire, whether you felt this might be a chance then of a change in the policy that would allow the hostages to be released.
Yeah, we felt supported. And those hundreds of thousands there on the streets demanded to get back all the hostages before it's too late. And that's what, like I said, that's what we're calling for.
How do you think Israel's new focus on Hezbollah now will affect the chance of getting Or and the other hostages released?
I think that everything is connected. And Hezbollah is a completely different issue, and it should be solved. But once again, that's part of the bigger picture. If the hostages are back, everything can be solved. The conflict with Hezbollah, the conflict with Hamas, basically everything that's going on the Middle East can start recovering only after they are back.
Is it a bit of a catch-22 though, Michael? Because what you have now is you have the Houthis, you have Hezbollah, and then of course Hamas continuing its actions. And those others, Hezbollah, Houthis, they're trying to support Hamas because of the military action taking place. So it's almost like without any kind of ceasefire, everything is stuck.
Yes, but I think that people tend to forget that behind everything is Iran. They are financing all of them. They are financing Hezbollah, they are financing the Houthis, they are financing Hamas, obviously. So everything is connected. But to your question, yeah, I agree. There has to be a ceasefire. But before we can get to a ceasefire, we need the hostages back. The order of the things should be the other way around.
So if Prime Minister Netanyahu was sitting in this room with us, what would you ask him to do?
Very simple. Get to a deal. Seal a deal. Get the hostages back, and then do whatever you need to do with Hamas or Hezbollah or everyone else.
Let's get back to your little nephew, Almog. How has he coped with the past 12 months? Because it's been almost a year since, he's had a hug from his parents or had any kind of contact. I mean, I know it's difficult, but do you do your best to keep the memories of awe and his mum alive, or are you kind of trying to shelter him a little bit so he doesn't feel the depth of that loss?
Oh, it's very tricky, because on one hand we want him to remember, we want him to know who was his mom. We want him to remember all and know that all is there and he will be back and he is his father. So on one hand we tell him stories, we show him pictures, we show him videos, but on the other hand we don't want to deal with it too much, because obviously he misses them. He wants to see them. He wants to meet them again. Unfortunately, it's not possible with his mom, and we're still fighting to get his father back.
And it's even more tricky because, you know, as the time goes on, you're passing birthdays and anniversaries. Again, how do you treat those?
Those milestones are I think those are the hardest. He celebrated his birthday alone, and we threw him a big party to make him happy, and he was happy. For us, it was one of the saddest days of our lives, but we try to keep him happy and try to treat him like a normal kid. But obviously those milestones that are important in every parent's life are without his parents.
You know, talking of anniversaries, you said something very poignant a little while ago. You said October the 7th is coming round again, first year anniversary, but for you it's just another day. I wonder though, do you think there's any chance that when people do have to remember that date as it comes around, that it might create more impetus, more movement for something to be done? Because people now will say it has been a year and there hasn't been a resolution.
Now, obviously, you know, this date is symbolic, and yes, we can and need to use it in order to remind people that there's still no solution, that there are still 101 hostages in Gaza. So, you know, for me personally, it doesn't mean anything. It's just another day, but it is a day that we can use the media attention to remind the world that there are still hostages back in Gaza.
You know, Mike, like, you know, sitting with you, I can sense, obviously, the depth of the emotion. You know, it's your brother who's been taken hostage. You've lost your sister-in-law, who's his soulmate, and you're now dealing with, you know, looking after his 3-year-old son. Is there any time that you find it so much, the pressure to be so much, that you fear that this will never resolve positively, that you might not see Or again? How do you avoid getting into that kind of depth?
Obviously, this is somewhere inside my head all the time, but I try not to think about it, because for me there's no other way than him being back. I won't let this amazing boy to grow up without a father. And I promised my parents actually on the second day that I'll bring him back. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'll bring him back.
Now, we know that some of the hostages have been able to see news coverage from time to time, so trying to take a positive approach on this with the chance that Or might have a chance to see this interview, might have a chance to see what's going on. What message could you send to him now?
It's very simple. I try to approach him from time to time. I want him to know that we are looking up for Almog. We'll keep him happy. And I want him to stay strong and know that we are doing everything to bring him back, and that we'll bring him back.
Is there anything you could say to his captors?
I don't waste my time on those monsters. Those are not even human to me.
Well, Michael, I wish you luck getting your brother back, and thank you for making the time to talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Riz Khan. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.
Berlin. For its exuberant urban life and vibrant art scene, visit Berlin. The German capital features a cultural scene and unique lifestyle that's both fast-paced and relaxed. Also known as the hipster city of Europe, Berlin keeps alive with its alternative cultures and styles. In neighborhoods like Kreuzberg, Neukölln, and Friedrichshain are vibrant places where locals simply chill and enjoy the relaxed open spaces and fresh air. No city in Germany is, in fact, greener than Berlin, with its forests, lakes, and sprawling parks. Berlin is also a city full of history. The World War II, after all, began and ended in the city of Berlin. Most popular are the Brandenburg Gate and the Federal Chancellery, which are reflective of the nation's rich stories. Germany's capital is also home to its major government buildings, such as the historic Reichstag, or the seat of the German parliament. Of course, most remarkable are the Berlin Wall, the East Side Gallery, and the Holocaust Memorial. Historical feats aside, Berlin is also hip and happening with its streets of bars and clubs. The city has an active nightlife that guarantees massive parties and events practically every night. But the city is friendly to non-party goers too. It has relaxed beer gardens, small bars, hostels, and art galleries to suit different tastes. Famous as a city of art, Berlin has over 170 museums, including the famous Museum Island that puts treasures of the world on public display. Tourists often visit Berlin to attend ballets and operas at the city's major opera houses, as well as witness live performances by talented orchestras such as the world-class Berlin Philharmonic. And when it comes to food, Berlin has a lot to offer too. It's a great place for vegans. It has Turkish restaurants and supermarkets everywhere, and Italian, Mexican, and Asian food spots too. Food markets offering snacks, German wine and cheese, among others, will satisfy your palate as well. The neighborhoods in Kreuzberg and Neukölln are great for finding fine restaurants and quiet lounge bars, as well as dozens of coffee bars to enjoy. When it comes to shopping, there are well-known mainstream malls to visit, alongside independent boutiques nearby that offer endless choices for your lifestyle needs. One will also find small vintage stores within Berlin, some even selling second-hand books as well as high-end designer clothing.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence, they've got to have a vote and a say. It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday on Al Arabiya News. I'm Rosanna Lockwood, coming up on the show. Hezbollah repels incursions in Lebanon as Iran's foreign minister heads to Saudi Arabia for talks to try and stop the conflict. At least 45 Palestinians have been killed and 130 injured in Israeli attacks over the past 24 hours as heavy fighting traps 400,000 in Gaza. President Biden cancels his visit to Ukraine's donor summit to focus on domestic issues. In southern Lebanon, Hezbollah reported repelling 2 Israeli military advances, though its efforts to gain ground have stalled, with 3 Israeli soldiers wounded in the clashes. And this comes as Iran's foreign minister visits Saudi Arabia in an effort to halt the escalating conflict. According to Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baghei, Tehran's top diplomat Abbas Araghchi will push for diplomatic solutions aimed at stopping what he described as the Israeli regime's genocide and aggression, and to help ease the suffering of people in Gaza and Lebanon. Well, for more on the situation on the ground in Lebanon, I'm joined by the United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator for Lebanon, Imran Reza. So good of you to make time for us. Talk to me about what it's like in Beirut at the moment where you are, because overnight we heard Israeli airstrikes did continue, although some residents saying there appeared to be some less intensity, but I'm sure that doesn't come as much solace at the moment.
No, not at the moment. I mean, we've had, I think now, 15 days, starting pretty much on the 23rd of September, of a really dramatic level of escalation. And it has progressively got, it's frankly got worse until, as you're saying, last night there was a bit of a respite on it, but today we've had quite a bit of shelling also happening in different areas. And of course we also have what's happening on the ground in the south. But basically the consequences of all of this have been catastrophic. Up till, I mean, we're at 1 year, right, today, since all this began in Lebanon. And until, I'd say, the 22nd of September, we had a total of about 110,000 people displaced from conflict. So over 11 and a half months, that's what we had. In the last 15 days, that number has risen to well over 600,000. As well as about 600,000 internally displaced within Lebanon and about 300,000 that have crossed into Syria. So we have well over 1 million that are affected and close to 1 million displaced from this.
It's an extraordinary number. And as a humanitarian coordinator, how do you handle something like that?
Well, at the moment, it's been about essentially, I would say that the overall ask that we have is for a ceasefire, right? We want the firing, the shooting to stop in this. But while this has been going on, the two main things that we have been trying to push for is first respect of international humanitarian law. We need to be able to access people. They need to be able to access us and assistance and safety. And so that's one aspect of that. And the other aspect of it is, of course, not putting civilians at risk, in danger, protection of civilians, trying to make sure that health workers are protected, that frontline workers are protected. And as we've seen, the level of casualties and fatalities amongst all of those groups has been enormous. So there is a call for protecting civilians, respecting international humanitarian law. Sorry, and then it's about resources. We were very underfunded even before this crisis. During the first 11 months of this crisis, we launched a flash appeal a week ago, 8 days ago, asking for $426 million. We need those resources. We need to be able to meet the health needs, the water needs, the food needs, the shelter needs, the protection needs, all of this, and that needs resources. We are fortunate, I would say, in a way, compared to 2006, because we have a lot of humanitarian agencies here. We have quite a humanitarian setup here. It needs the resources in order to function. And what we've also been doing a lot of is working very closely with the government response. And I think, as many of your viewers would know, the last 4 or 5 years have been years of crisis in Lebanon. The socioeconomic, the financial, COVID, the Beirut blast. People were exhausted after all of that, and then we get this particular crisis that's now lasted for a year, and we don't see the end in sight. So out of that, the government also doesn't have the resources, the strength, the capacity for what's needed right now. So we have to work very closely and support them and try and work together as we're going ahead.
That was going to be one of my questions to you, because obviously a caretaker government or a caretaker prime minister, certainly in Lebanon at the moment, and how coordinated they can be to work with humanitarian agencies. But as you're saying there, clearly the will is there and they're doing what they can. In terms of that number that you're trying to raise up, was it 426 million? How confident are you that you will achieve that?
I think the indications we've got from a lot of our sort of very reliable donors is very positive. And so there are a number, we've got more or less pledges to about half of that so far, but the actual funds that we've received are only around 56 million, about 12%. But I'm confident that they will come through and help us with this. At the same time, there's a lot of bilateral and in-kind donations and contributions happening. Over the last few days, we've seen a number of flights from the UAE, from the Emirates. Yesterday, there were flights, an air bridge that's starting with Qatar. And so a lot of supplies have started coming in that way. And just today, I was hearing that the EU will also start an air bridge to try to provide assistance in. And so that is extremely necessary, and it's welcome news.
You mentioned aid access before. That's been a persistent issue, certainly in Gaza over the last year. Foreign governments, even in the Western allied governments to Israel, who are still supplying funding for arms for ostensibly, they say, defence purposes. I'm thinking of the United Kingdom here, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, speaking in the last 24 hours, but also calling on Israel to ensure that there is access for aid agencies into Gaza. Now, we're talking about Gaza there. How concerned are you that that situation will be replicated in Lebanon?
We're trying to make sure that we have access. We're trying to make sure that we have contact with all parties to ensure that we have humanitarian access. And we'll have to see how it goes on. Over the last week, we have done a number of missions and convoys. Last Thursday or Friday, we had the first, the escalation started on the 23rd of September. And since then, until last Thursday, Friday, we were not able to take a lot of relief down to the south, to Tyre in this case. So there was a convoy that was arranged that had WFP, UNICEF, the Norwegian Refugee Council, the Order of Malta, and OCHA, a number of our key partners going down there. And it was successful and it worked well. We're also trying to help partners of ours who are trying to arrange evacuations of people that want to leave. And here I'll stress that it's people that actually want to leave, and because there are many that don't want to leave and want to remain in their villages at this time. So there were a number of people, about 1,000 from Ain Ibil in the south, and it was the Order of Malta that was organizing that. So we tried to make sure that we have the right communication with parties to ensure that that safe movement can happen. So we're constantly doing this humanitarian notification, we call it. Some people call it deconfliction. Unfortunately, yesterday, one of our partners, AMEL, which is an NGO that works throughout Lebanon, mainly in the health sector, and has been a key responder to everything that's been happening for years, frankly. It's one of the oldest NGOs. One of their educational institutions was struck yesterday. So it's, it just underlines still that we need to keep pushing as much as we can to have everyone respect international humanitarian law on this.
And before I return to talking about the efforts for a ceasefire, at least diplomatic channels being open, you mentioned there about people wanting to stay in their towns and their villages. Obviously, southern Lebanon being heavily impacted at the moment, Beirut as well. People, reports we're seeing, and you can tell us this, they're sleeping on the streets, they're sleeping in beaches, they're sleeping in Martyrs Square. Talk to us about that. Is that because they feel safer than inside buildings?
No, I think they're out because we don't have enough shelter at this time. I mean, we've already almost 1,000 schools that have been allocated as collective shelters. we, together with the government, and it's primarily the government on this, that is looking for all sorts of different space and how we can make that habitable. So a huge priority has obviously been shelter, and on a daily basis we're having this discussion with the government at the Sarai, with all our technical expertise at their disposal on trying to see what we can do. I think a lot of people have now been moved into shelters. There are a lot of other people that are in empty apartments, in other apartments, or with relatives. A lot of our staff have a lot of relatives living in their apartments right now. A lot of our staff are also, my colleagues are also displaced. So everyone is a bit in the same boat about this, and we're trying to find and agree on the right locations for this. And they have to be places where we can, very quickly deal with issues of water and sanitation and make sure that the right sort of assistance is being done, because otherwise you're going to have, and we've seen it in so many different situations, you're going to have an outbreak of disease.
Now, thank you for giving that detail, just so people can sort of reconnect with the human side of it. Let's think now about the diplomatic channels and the politics that's happening above everything else. We had another statement from Benjamin Netanyahu last night from Israel, basically calling on the Lebanese people to rise up against Hezbollah. And then it's expected today that the US President Joe Biden is going to be speaking, or has spoken, to Israel's Prime Minister. What are you thinking is happening at the political level here? Do you have any hopes that there will be pressure on any form of ceasefire?
Frankly, I am so concentrated as humanitarian coordinator on the humanitarian response and the humanitarian situation. There are other colleagues that are far more focused on that. What I can say is basically the two asks that we have on this is that those that can have influence on it, try to move towards a ceasefire. That's the obvious thing that we need in order to get to the situation where we talk about something sustainable. And in the case of this situation, it's obviously implementation of Resolution 1701. And the other ask is again, and I keep repeating it, is respect for international humanitarian law. Allow us to access people, allow them to access us, and protect civilians.
And understood that, day to day you're more focused there on ground level and what's needed. In terms of the locations of where you're dealing with, obviously we just mentioned Beirut, but talk to us about southern Lebanon as well, because a severe aerial bombardment, of course, from Israel on that area targeting Hezbollah sites, but also ground level clashes as well. Lots of villages and towns affected. What's the situation like there?
I think the situation must be quite horrific. It is quite horrific down there. And there is a lot, there's been a huge increase in shelling, but one shouldn't discount how much shelling there has been also earlier. Now you have things happening on the ground as well. So there's been a great level of destruction, and that's something that we also need to track more, to have access and try to understand exactly what the level of it is, because we all hope for that day after when we start moving towards recovery and reconstruction. On the one side, you have to have the political process happening. On the other side, you have to help people get back to their homes and their livelihoods. What people have been so worried about this time, because it is different than 2006. In 2006, it was 34 days, 33 days. And very quickly things moved and there was recovery, reconstruction. This time it's been a year of this. And people haven't had the resilience, the buffer, the cushion that they had in 2006 because of the last 4 or 5 years of crisis, of impoverishment. This country has never been as impoverished as it's been in the last 5 years. So people need their livelihoods. They're very worried about the destruction of their houses. They're worried about their futures. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of trauma at this time.
I was going to ask you about that because we have spoken on this show to clinical psychologists out of Beirut about the trauma that's happening. But it leads me to think about, as you mentioned there, this has been a sort of year in the build-up. And of course, there was crossfire sort of attacks between Hezbollah and Israel over the course of the last year. But life continued almost as normal in Beirut. And certainly in the weeks leading up to the last few weeks, many of us who knew Lebanese people, those Lebanese people were trying to deliberate whether or not they should get out of Beirut if they had the means to, or get out of Lebanon if they had the means to. Of course, a lot of Lebanese cannot leave. What was that build-up like? Do you think anybody there actually thought it was going to get this bad?
I mean, clearly a lot of people didn't think it would get this bad. You had, as you were saying, a sort of almost a schizophrenia in the country at a certain point, where a lot was going on, and it was there was a certain pattern to it. People referred to it as tit for tat, but it was always escalating. We always did see that there was escalation happening on it. And amongst the humanitarians, amongst all of us, and the discussion also with different government counterparts was all about contingency planning. It was all about what happens when it gets worse and how do we move to that. I don't think any of us anticipated that it would happen as dramatically as it did on the 23rd, the number of strikes and the very huge level of displacement. But obviously that has also changed the situation, and people here in Beirut, people in the north, the Bekaa already earlier was suffering from this, but the whole of the south and the whole of the country is very affected right now by this. And I think you have the same level of anxiety about the future throughout the country now.
Are your fears that this will continue for longer than 2006? I mean, I appreciate we've just talked about it building up to a year, but I mean the most sort of aggressive conflict that we've seen in the last few weeks. Could it go on longer than a month, do you think?
I really don't know. Of course, none of us do. We know that the consequences already are huge. The humanitarian challenges are huge. We're all just trying to address these and trying to call on those that can to try to stop this now. We need it to stop.
United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator for Lebanon, Imran Reza, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Israel and Hezbollah have continued to exchange heavy gunfire as the Israel Defense Forces indicated a possible expansion of their ground military offensive in Lebanon, mobilizing their 1st Reserve Division to operate in the southwest region of the country. Now, this does come as heavy fighting continues, Israeli forces again invading northern Gaza as well. For more on Israel's war on two fronts, I'm joined now by retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell from the United Kingdom. Sean, thanks for making time for us on this. And it's been a little while now, the conflict that we're seeing across Lebanon, certainly up to a year at this point in terms of the cross-border fire, but with really the ground clashes we're now seeing in southern Lebanon and the aerial bombardment across Lebanon by Israeli forces. Did you expect we would see the war opening up on a second front like this after the year we've seen in Gaza?
Yeah, good afternoon, Rosanna. Yeah, bluntly, yes. I mean, if you remember, after the heinous acts of the 7th of October, Israel focused its attention on Gaza. But once that operation had finished, it had been, through the last year, being constantly attacked from the north by Hezbollah, because Iran has tried to arm its proxies to try to support Hamas. They knew that Hamas was going to get likely to be the wrong end of the fighting. And once the operation in Gaza is largely finished, Israel's pivoted to the north. The challenge now, of course, is to work out what are their objectives in the north. It seems to me that the operation up there by the Israelis is twofold, one of which is we're seeing precision strikes into Beirut itself, seemingly targeting Hezbollah leadership, commander control and weapons storage. And the second arm seems to be to try to recreate the buffer zone to the south of the country. For those who are interested, at the end of the other 2006 war, obviously there was a United Nations resolution 1701, which basically said Hezbollah go north of the Litani River, Israeli forces south of the Blue Line, and the buffer zone in between should only be populated by United Nations forces and Lebanese army. The trouble is, Hezbollah immediately moved into that area, and that has led to a compromise of the security of northern Israel. And Israel is clearly trying to clear Hezbollah out of that area, but it's a very difficult operation.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the sort of the ground operation, especially in southern Lebanon with you, but let's focus a moment on those aerial bombardments, because I know that's your area of expertise, a former airman yourself, retired Air Vice Marshal. When you say they're targeted aerial raids on buildings, obviously people have pointed out this has been on residential areas in Beirut, the Israeli forces and the Israeli Air Force saying, well, that's where the Hezbollah commanders have been hiding out. And of course, they have assassinated several of the top brass of Hezbollah through these airstrikes. So in your experience and expertise, how targeted have these airstrikes been?
Well, I think it's always going to be difficult when you're targeting in a residential area. And I think the tragedy is that clearly a lot of civilians have died. But what you also have to be aware that as a military operation, it's always intelligence-led. And I think over the last few weeks, first of all, with the Israelis blowing up those pagers, then the walkie-talkies, and then systematically going after the Hezbollah leadership. And whilst it's very difficult to cross-check this information, but if you do one of those wiring diagrams of the Hezbollah command and control structure, it does appear that systematically Israel's been taking them out. And of course, most of them will probably be hidden away in bunkers underground. So I suspect what we're seeing is a lot of bunker buster type weapons being used. And it's just a testament, I think, in a way, to the intelligence of the Israelis that they've managed to infiltrate the Hezbollah command and control. They do appear to be putting Hezbollah on the back foot. The challenge, of course, is how far do they go? And of course, that when we were involved in similar operations in the military, there is a long-run conflict. You have to be very careful when civilian casualties are going to be involved. Clearly, at the moment, we're not seeing a vast array of those bombings. More seem to be specifically tailored strikes, but very difficult to know when that's going to stop.
And I appreciate you're more a military expert than a sort of a Hezbollah analyst or Hezbollah expert, but just from the military point of view, what type of impact does it have to take out the command structure of a military group like Hezbollah? What will that mean to the sort of the other ranks below?
The trouble is, from a command and control perspective, a lot of these groups are like hydras, quite frankly. You chop off a head, another one will grow back. And I think Hezbollah, one of their anointed sort of commentators, said that there were no vacancies available at the moment. In other words, they've quickly filled those slots up. The problem is, though, is that there is an established command and control chain, and Hezbollah will need that to be in place to mount any form of effective resistance against the Israeli attack. And at the moment, it's pretty clear that Hezbollah are on the back foot. There's even been suggestions that Hezbollah are looking for some form of ceasefire just to preserve. But let's be quite clear, there's no way that Israel is going to be able to destroy Hezbollah. They, unlike Hamas in Gaza, where Israel surrounded the area, Lebanon, Israel can't surround it. There's a ready flow of military weapons, ammunition and fighters that Iran can supply through Lebanon into support the Hezbollah fighters. So all that Israel can do really is to destroy the current framework and buy some breathing time. And the tragedy as a military guy is military operations only create the conditions for a political settlement to endure. What is that political settlement? What is the end game for the military? None of that is clear.
Interesting, yeah. And people talk about sort of Israel bombing people to get around a table. That sort of military route to diplomacy at the moment, so that they believe is required. In terms of returning just to the air capabilities here, because Israel's air capability is vast, it's strong, and when we saw Iranian missiles and Hezbollah missiles targeting various Israeli sites over the last week or so, they seem to be targeting air bases and seemed very set on, if they could, taking out Israel's F-35s. I don't know whether they have. That doesn't seem to have been confirmed. But you can imagine those would be pretty valued targets for Iran and Hezbollah.
Yes, I think let's take those two separately, Hezbollah and then Iran. There's no doubt Israel is the dominant military power in the region with its stealth fighters, as you say, the F-35. It's got a very complex array of weapon systems, missile systems, intelligence, satellite-based and drone technology, and, of course, is supported by the US. Hezbollah doesn't really have an answer to that. It has been an irritant on the side of Israel, firing rockets largely unguided, and the Iron Dome system is relatively good at defending against that. The most recent attack from Iran, those 180 ballistic missiles, unfortunately, fighter jets don't really have a capability to shoot those down. That is a very specialist task. It's a very expensive offensive task. The Arrow system from Israel and, of course, the Patriot system from the US is really mainly, that's the main capability there. I think the worry for Iran, turning to Iran, is that Israel will do some form of retaliation. It could be military targets, it could be energy targets, but it also could be the nuclear facilities that Iran is trying to develop its nuclear weapon. Now, the US is very clear it doesn't want Israel to attack those targets. But if you were Israel, you'd be saying, when, not if, Iran develops a nuclear weapon, that's going to present an existential threat to Israel. So diplomacy doesn't seem to have stopped Iran with its development. Therefore, it might well be that Israel decides to have a go. And if it does have a go, the stealth fighters are an asymmetric advantage that Israel has over Iran. And I have no doubt that they will form part of whatever strike they decide to do against Iran, specifically if they go after the nuclear facilities.
And just finally, Sean, I did promise to get back to talking about the ground fighting, especially that we're seeing in southern Lebanon. And some analysts saying that Hezbollah, despite the force of the Israeli military, Hezbollah may have the upper hand when it comes to ground operations in southern Lebanon. What do you say to that?
Well, I think you have to look through, as a military guy, you study your history. 2006, the last war, the Israeli military are far dominant. But as soon as you go into territory like Lebanon, it's like putting your arm into a mangle. The further you go in, the more painful it is the more casualties you take. And bluntly, the Hezbollah have had 2 decades to plan for this exact eventuality. And there are all sorts of reports of them mining, setting booby traps, blowing up properties as soon as the Israeli forces go in. And this is into the buffer zone. This is before really Israel gets involved in any form of further move into the Lebanon. So bluntly, it's a question of how many casualties Israel's prepared to take. It does favour Hezbollah. Hezbollah will never win the battle, but they can certainly make it incredibly painful for the Israeli Defence Forces. And I suspect we're going to see a lot more of that over the coming days and weeks.
Retired Air Vice Marshal, military expert Sean Bell, thanks so much for your insights. Well, we begin in Gaza, where the Health Ministry reports at least 45 Palestinians have been killed and 130 injured in Israeli attacks over the past 24 hours. Health officials have resisted Israeli directives to evacuate 3 hospitals, Kamal Adwan, Indonesian and Al Awda, despite receiving a 24-hour ultimatum. Intense fighting persists as Israeli forces launch another incursion into northern Gaza, leaving around 400,000 Palestinians trapped and raising concerns for their safety after most evacuation orders were largely disregarded. To discuss this, I'm joined by now Jacob Wallace, a former US diplomat who served as Consul General in Jerusalem during the George Bush and Obama administrations and later as US Ambassador to Tunisia under President Obama. He played a pivotal role in managing US relations in the region, particularly during key moments of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and Tunisia's post-revolution transition. Mr. Wallace, thank you very much for joining me. And let's talk about this dire situation that is being reported out of northern Gaza. Whilst all eyes at the moment are most of the time on Lebanon, of course, there is still attacks happening, this time in the Jabalia camp. And can you talk to me about what you think the strategy might be here?
Well, thank you for having me on. I think the key point is that Israel does not seem to have a strategy. Israel has obviously a very powerful military force, and they've done tremendous damage to Hamas over the past year, but they have not been able to eradicate Hamas completely. And Israel has no strategy for what to do about the day after in Gaza. So that troubles me quite a bit. Without a strategy, you can win all the battles, but you can still lose the war.
That's really interesting. You say that. I don't often hear that in the interviews I'm doing at the moment, that you believe that there is no strategy for Israel. So what is it? Is it just reaction? Is it chaos? Is it that they have opened up too many fronts in the war? Is it push on their resources?
Well, I think Israel has resources. And as I said, the military has achieved impressive tactical results. The problem is that what they've described as their objective, which is total victory, as Prime Minister Netanyahu put it, is simply not possible in a situation like Gaza, in an adversary like Hamas. Hamas is not a military force in the conventional sense. It is a militia in the sense and it has deep support within the population of Gaza. So you can't eradicate a movement like that. You can certainly do damage to it militarily, but you need to have a plan for what to do after you've achieved your military objective. And this is what Israel is lacking at the moment.
So there's two parts of that I want to ask you about. The first is those war goals, the war aims, the original objectives Netanyahu went in with to Gaza post-October 7th last year. The key ones being the eradication of those that caused October 7th, the eradication of the Hamas command and control structure, and as much of Hamas as possible, it seemed, and the return of the hostages. Of course, some 100 hostages expected to still be in the Gaza Strip, and all of Hamas have certainly not eradicated. How much more do you think they will actually be able to achieve? How much longer do you think they're going to keep pushing in Gaza?
Well, I think the Israelis will continue to push in Gaza and to continue to do as much damage as they can to Hamas. But there's a limit to what they can achieve in terms of, certainly in terms of total victory. I don't think that's possible. What they have been able to do is decimate the military forces of Hamas. But as we see in Jabalia, Hamas is able to reconstitute itself, to continue to attack Israeli forces in the Gaza Strip. Also, in terms of the hostages, Israel has not been able to achieve the result that it wants through military means. There are still over 100 hostages. Perhaps half of them are alive. It's not clear exactly what the situation is. But the military force alone has not resulted in the release of the hostages. That will require diplomacy. That will require a ceasefire, but Israel seems to have scorned that approach and to continue its military operations against Hamas.
What do you make of the intended strategy as it was being discussed a few weeks ago? This was before the pager explosions, the walkie-talkie explosions that we saw across Lebanon, and then the military activity we saw by Israel in and around and above Lebanon. Was this idea of escalate to de-escalate just in order to get people around a negotiating table? Do you think there was anything to that?
Well, I'm not sure what a strategy of escalating to de-escalate really makes a lot of sense. The objective that the Israelis set in Lebanon is a little bit more achievable than in Gaza. What they said specifically was they wanted to create the conditions to allow the Israeli residents of northern Israel to return to their homes. That is a specific objective. It is achievable. They're using military means to achieve it now. But ultimately, it will require a ceasefire and diplomatic efforts to reestablish the situation that would prevail of the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. That's the bedrock resolution that the UN adopted after the end of the 2006 fighting. It was never fully implemented. So what Israel is trying to achieve, in fact, is to put that back into force. And to expel Hezbollah from the strip along the Lebanon-Israel border. That may be more achievable, but again, the fighting has been very difficult. Israel has done a lot of damage to Hezbollah militarily, but it's not clear that they can totally eradicate Hezbollah as well.
And that was the point I was going to come to, because you spoke in your first answer about your concerns for post-conflict Gaza and what would happen, and in terms of Israel trying to meet these military aims of decimating Hamas and now trying to decimate Hezbollah as well and take it out root and branch. And obviously concerns abound that this may instead radicalize new generations of people in the Gaza Strip and in Lebanon as well to become Hamas and Hezbollah fighters. Do you think there's something to that?
I do. I think it's particularly a serious problem in Gaza, where you've got a large population, 2 million people, who've almost all been displaced from their homes. They were not very favorable to Israel to begin with, but they're now much more aggrieved with what Israel has done with the high casualty count, the displacement of people from their homes. So I think the next generation of Gazans will be even more willing to go into the ranks of Hamas to fight Israel. It's not a prospect that leads to peace in the long run. And that, I think, is one of the most damaging consequences of the fighting in Gaza over the past year.
Let's talk about what international players can do, if anything, at this point, particularly the US, where you're speaking to us from. Today, there was supposed to be a meeting between Israel's Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, and the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, to discuss Israel's military response, as is intended, to the Iranian missile barrage we saw on Israel around a week ago. That meeting was postponed. We understand from the Israeli side, the Pentagon spokesperson saying they didn't really have much more detail than that at the time, that there didn't appear to be tensions between the US and Israel. But what do you read into that?
My understanding is that the reason for the postponement has to do with Israeli internal politics more than anything else. That Prime Minister Netanyahu was not happy that the Defense Minister, Mr. Gallant, was traveling to Washington to talk about the response to the Iranian attack with his American counterparts. And President Biden had not yet spoken to the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister insisted that they have a conversation with President Biden first. That seems to be more about Israeli politics than anything else. The fact that the Israeli Defense Minister is unable to travel to Washington to discuss coordination and what's going on with his American counterparts seems very distressing to me. The Prime Minister will try to prevent something like that from happening.
That chimes in with an interview I had with a journalist, a Jerusalem-based Israeli journalist last night, who said that she was in the press briefing with the military forces about the latest activity that day, and they hadn't realised that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was putting out that statement last night in video on social media platforms, talking to the people of Lebanon, asking them to rise up against Hezbollah. And when the journalists asked the military spokespeople in the room about the statement, they weren't aware of it. There clearly is, as you point out there seems to be a lack of communication or cohesion in the Israeli government at the moment. Is that what you would also read from that?
Yes, that's correct. And I think it's very troublesome that there is this lack of cohesion at the leadership level in Israel. When you have the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister at odds with each other, not coordinating with each other, not even speaking to each other in some cases, it's very worrisome about the future prospect of what Israel is trying to achieve. It makes Israel's goals seem even farther from being able to be achieved in that situation.
In terms of an Israeli response to last week's Iranian missile barrage, which we must remember was intense, and we hadn't seen anything like that for quite some time, missiles fired directly from Iran over onto Israel, there has been this expected significant response from Israel. President Biden saying he would not support an Israeli strike against Iranian nuclear or energy in response to the missile attack on Israel last week. He said the response should be proportionate. What would proportionate look like?
Well, it's hard to be specific, and I think the Israelis are being careful about what they're doing, and they are trying to coordinate with the United States. I think it's true that both Israel and Iran do not want a wider war if they can avoid it. They've certainly been willing to attack each other, but within certain limits and certain boundaries. So the Israelis are searching for a way to hit Iran back hard in response to what they did a week ago in Israel, but not so hard as to precipitate a full-scale war, which could be quite dangerous. The Iranians, for their part, I think also want to avoid a wider war. I think they're afraid of Israel's military might. They're also afraid of the United States, which could come to Israel's assistance if the fighting gets out of control. So both sides seemingly want to avoid a war, but in this kind of situation, a miscalculation by either side could set off a much bigger conflagration, even if both parties do not really want that to happen.
I mean, in terms of those calculations, there was reporting that Israel reportedly cancelled an attack plan because there were rumours that Iran might be conducting its first ever nuclear bomb test, which would, of course, be absolutely catastrophic in terms of if we saw that type of escalation. Does this mean that we are seeing Israel showing restraint?
Well, I don't know that it's restraint, but I think Israel is trying to be cautious and to try to basically thread the needle to find a way to hit back at Iran hard, but not so hard as to precipitate a spiral out of control. So the fact that Israel has waited and not acted precipitously, I think that's at least a good sign that they're trying to think through what are the consequences of their actions here.
Let's think about some of the other players as well outside of the US. Turkey has been one in particular that's been interesting to watch over the course of the last week. On the anniversary of October 7th, President Erdogan releasing a statement, once again calling what Israel's actions are in Gaza, particularly a genocide. Turkey since then announcing it's going to send 2 Navy ships to Lebanon, but saying that's for the evacuation of Turkish citizens. What do you think of Turkey's part in all of this? Do they have a critical role to play? How much pressure gets applied?
Well, I don't think Turkey has a really critical role to play. They've chosen sides in this battle. They've taken the side of Hamas and Hezbollah, and they've been very critical of Israel, as you mentioned. They refer to Israel's actions as genocide. So they have very little influence with Israel anymore. So while they're clearly trying to play a role, they don't have the relationship with both sides that is necessary to play a critical role here. What's been more effective is the combination of the United States and Qatar and Egypt trying to negotiate a ceasefire. While the Americans don't have contacts with Hamas or Hezbollah, working with Egypt and Qatar is a way of bridging that gap and trying to find an outcome. Of course, the United States and Qatar and Egypt have not been successful so far, but it's not due to a lack of trying. It's more a result of the fact that Israel and Hamas have incompatible goals in Gaza right now that have been impossible to bridge.
Do you think we could see a sort of re-emergence of those types of meetings, of firing up at them again? Because as you said, over the course of the last year, we did see a lot of mediation happening. Egypt, Qatar, Gulf states as well. Do you think we might finally see people really trying to get round a table? Because, you know, since the Lebanon situation really escalated, there doesn't appear to have been as much as there has been effort-wise in terms of securing a ceasefire.
Right. I think the mediators will try again. I think it's inevitable that there will be a ceasefire at some point. It's hard to see that right now, given the gaps between the two sides. But the only way out of this situation is through a ceasefire that includes Gaza and Lebanon as well. So I expect that the United States, working again with Egypt and Qatar, will make another effort again to try to accomplish that.
And with the United States, obviously, we are heading into an election for you guys over there in the coming weeks. And in terms of Biden doing what he can in the last days of his administration, if Harris was to win, Kamala Harris, for the Democrats, how do you think she would be handling this the minute she got into office? Because it's presumably still going to be a very big ongoing issue.
Well, I think the issue will continue. You're right about that. The next president won't take office until January, whether that's Vice President Harris or the Republican candidate Donald Trump. So there's still quite a bit of time between now and then that the Biden administration will have to take charge of this matter. I'm not sure exactly how a new president would handle this issue. Both of the candidates are in the midst of a very tough election battle right now. They're trying to gain whatever advantages possible. So they're not really speaking in clear terms about what their policies would be on this issue. And it's hard to predict. Again, since they will not take office until January, the situation on the ground in Gaza, in Lebanon, and between Israel and Iran will certainly evolve between now and then. So they will be reacting to events that have not yet happened yet.
And it became such a polarizing issue in the United Kingdom. I'm thinking, because I was working there over the summer, in terms of the way people actually thought and voted when there was a general election happening there. And it actually had impact on who could run in certain constituencies, as we call them in the UK, because people were so either pro-Palestine or so pro-Israel. The issue has become so divisive and polarizing. Is that the case in the US as well when it comes to voters?
Well, at a national level, I don't think this issue will play that much in terms of the election outcome. But the way our system works, of course, we have the Electoral College. So the votes are basically state by state. And in some states, particularly Michigan, where there are a large number of Arab American residents, it could have an impact. And given the closeness of this campaign and the election right now, any one state might be the tipping point between the two sides. So while at a national level, the issue is not decisive, it could be decisive at a local level, which could have a big impact on the outcome of the race.
Mr. Wallace, we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you for speaking to us about a range of issues.
My pleasure.
Joe Biden has been forced to withdraw from what would have been the highest level meeting of Ukrainian donors in Germany as the US president cancelled his trip to focus on the hurricane in Florida. The now postponed gathering, considered crucial to advancing the victory plan presented by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to allies last month, was intended to reaffirm steadfast support for Kyiv and secure additional aid commitments ahead of winter months. Now, this does come as Russia's defense ministry says it captured 2 more settlements in eastern Ukraine, the latest gains in their drive to take full control of the Donbass region. Although recent territorial losses seemingly point to Moscow winning on the battlefield, Ukraine is saying their strategy is trading space for Russian losses. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte warning Ukraine faces its most difficult winter since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022. Well, I'm joined now by the former US ambassador to Ukraine and now senior director at the Atlantic Council, John Herbst. John, thank you for making time for us. And in terms of, let's start with those words from the new Secretary-General of NATO, Mark Rutte, saying that Ukraine faces its most difficult winter, and that's saying something because it's been a few winters now. What do you make of that? How do you assess the current state of things for Ukraine?
If you talk about the winter, what he's referring to principally is the massive attack over the past 6 or so months on Ukraine's energy grid. And they've lost 9 gigawatts of power, which is a startling amount. So the difficult winter they faced 2 years ago will be even more difficult this year. That I think is the main thing. But on the battlefield, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please talk to us about what your assessment of the battlefield.
On the battlefield, it's true that Russia took the town of Vuhledar, a town they've been trying to take for many months, actually for over a year, a week or so ago. And that was a tactical victory for the Russians. But as the BBC reported, the Russians took enormous casualties for an elite unit there. And as the infamous Russian hyper-nationalist Gerasim Strelkov wrote on Telegram, this is actually a strategic defeat for Russia because they've been taking so many casualties for tiny incremental gains in Ukraine. So the war on the battlefield is not going as badly as many Westerners talk about it.
Talk to me about then what do you think of this supposed Ukrainian strategy to essentially kind of deplete Russian resources and military? Do you think that will prove effective?
I think it is having a substantial, for Ukraine, positive impact. But it is true that Russia does have far more resources to Ukraine, and Putin seems willing to sacrifice his soldiers in these kamikaze attacks, in which most of them are killed. So this remains to be seen. I just think it's premature to say that Moscow's got the upper hand, especially as we watch the remarkable effectiveness of Ukraine's drone strikes on ammunition depots and military bases in Ukraine. The third major depot, in this time in the Bryansk Oblast in Russia, was struck just last night.
I'll come back to the drone attacks and the ongoing efforts by Ukraine in the western regions of Russia. But in terms of the Russian forces and the military, so we can get a sense of that, the health of them currently. I mean, we're getting even reports, and this albeit from South Korean Defense Ministry at the moment, that North Korean soldiers are dying whilst fighting alongside Russian soldiers in Ukraine. How wide do you think this draft is going for Russia in order to get enough men on the battlefield?
Putin does have problems conscripting. We saw what happened when he announced his partial mobilization 2 years ago. There was great political unhappiness. He's managed to get by increasing the pay for volunteer soldiers, but also by rough methods of conscription in the outlying areas of Russia and in the non-ethnic Russian parts of Russia. Eventually, this may come back to bite him, but right now he seems to be able to manage. But reports of the Russians seeking soldiers in the global south, seeking soldiers from Central Asia, now seeking soldiers from North Korea, point to the fact that this is not a particularly popular war in Russia itself, which is a problem for Putin.
Now, returning to those drone strikes that you mentioned there, Russia's air defense unit saying they destroyed 47 Ukrainian drones targeting its west. How are Ukrainian efforts going, do you think, especially in regions like Kursk?
Well, the drone campaign has been remarkably successful. The idea in a drone attack is you send a swarm of them, and air defense systems take down some, but the rest get through to their targets. And that's what happened last night. Russian sources say they shot down a bunch of Ukrainian drones. They don't mention that a major arms depot in Bryansk was hit, and it is now lighting up the skies there. And this follows, of course, their massive attack in the Tver Oblast, which registered as something between 2.8 or 3.2 on the Richter scale. The explosions were so massive. And then the successful attacks after that in Krasnodar. So this is something which is seriously complicating the Russian war effort, and that obviously is a very good thing.
Now, away from the battlefield, as you mentioned there, potentially the Ukrainian efforts are going much better than some would think, some detractors and some cynics. So let's think about the political side of things. Biden, of course, having to withdraw from this meeting of big donors in Germany, understandably big hurricane hitting southeast US at the moment. But at this meeting, we're expecting Zelensky of Ukraine to draw up his victory plan to end the war, and that's widely expected to focus heavily on this demand to have these long-range missiles that you can fire deep into Russia. Can you see any Ukrainian allies getting behind that plan?
Well, I think that half of NATO, maybe more, strongly believe that Zelensky should be able to use the American ATACMS and the British longer-range missiles on targets in Russia. The problem is you have a White House that has been intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats, something once again brought to light by the recent book put out by Bob Woodward. And this is both very bad international politics, and it makes the United States look weak.
Indeed, this book by Bob Woodward you mentioned, just in case our viewers aren't aware, this famous Watergate journalist with some absolutely bombshell exposés about particularly Donald Trump's relationship with Putin during his time in office and then post-presidency as well, talking about several private phone calls with Putin since leaving office and also giving Putin COVID testing machines in 2020. This is according to the book War. Also, as you mentioned there, the idea of Putin actually selectively using nuclear weaponry as part of the conflict. I mean, how do you think, obviously the headlines have already come out about this, but will this surprise anyone? And will it change the impact of the US election at all, the way people think about Trump?
I don't think it's going to surprise many people. Will it have an impact on the election? I'm not sure. People who support Trump tend to discount the mainstream media, and they may well simply discount this book, although it should not be discounted. But it is true that the election will be decided on the margins, and the voters who have not made up their mind yet, some of those who've been skeptical of Trump for various reasons may find this is one more reason to vote against him. So, but it's still too hard to say precisely what impact this will have, if any, on the election.
Interesting. And obviously the main, I believe, thesis of the book is trying to explore Trump as a power player on the global stage and whether or not he is as influential as he claims he is, especially with regard to what some people call strongman leaders, people like Putin and others around the world. What about the fears that Harris would not be strong enough to face those types of leaders? Do you think a Harris foreign policy agenda is a continuation of the Biden administration?
To be fair, it's not fully clear, but certainly the people around Harris, like Phil Gordon, have long been colleagues of the current national security leaders like Blinken and Sullivan. And his writings and instincts seem to fall in a similar cast. But of course, ultimately, it depends on the main person. So what would Harris do? She doesn't have nearly the experience of Biden. But I think expecting something similar to the Biden administration, including on Russia's aggression in Ukraine, is probably sound.
Let's return a moment to the weapons, because you mentioned something interesting there. Beyond the long-range missiles that Zelensky has been asking for to fire, if he needed to, into Russia. An interesting report recently at the US military's top commander in Europe compiled this weapons list of US weaponry, essentially, that Ukraine could use in its fight against Russia, but hasn't been supplied so far. This includes air-to-surface missiles and a secure communications network used by NATO. So for the outsiders approaching this, can you explain to us potentially why that hasn't been made available to Ukraine yet?
I can't be certain about the communications equipment. Regarding the surface-to-air missiles, which also have a range like our ATACMS of, several hundred kilometers, this once again comes back to the excessive caution, which is a polite way to phrase it, of the White House because of Putin's constant nuclear bluster. You know, nuclear weapons are not a joke. Russia is the only pure nuclear power out there with us. So we have to look at this very seriously, but we should not be self-deterring because of Putin's bluster, because we've already passed, and Ukraine has passed, many of his alleged red lines for the possible use of nuclear weapons. And never before in American diplomatic history have senior officials said publicly that we cannot do something because our adversary is threatening the use of nukes. That was true during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was true during the Berlin Crisis. We never did that. And that's just a sign of weakness.
Are we reaching a state of sort of mutually assured destruction once again, that kind of the need for that balance?
Correct. Well, we have that balance. We need to operate as if we're a superpower and not being intimidated by a far weaker adversary like Russia.
In terms of if Putin is to succeed in Ukraine, what does that look like if it did indeed happen over the course of the coming months? What could happen thereon?
If he succeeds in Ukraine, he's going to create more difficult problems for his neighbors, including perhaps for his NATO neighbors. Biden has several times said, he needs to say it more often, that if Putin wins in Ukraine, he may well move forward and attack a NATO state. We already see massive provocations against NATO from the Russians right now. Sabotage operations, cyber attacks, overflight of NATO territories with bombs heading for Ukraine. And the response to all this has been pretty much nothing. So he's already undermining NATO right now while he's fighting a major war in Ukraine. American national interests, NATO countries' national interests, require a Putin defeat in Ukraine. Biden sort of understands that, although he's never made the strong case to the American people. Sadly, the naive wing of the Republican Party seems not to understand that at all.
In terms of an attack potentially on a NATO country, do you feel like enough, particularly European, I'm thinking because they're the closest NATO countries, are alive to that threat? Because obviously the cohesion of the EU with member states like Hungary causing issues over previous years as well. Do you think there is enough sense of danger and alertness now, given that the war has gone on for so long?
I don't have any doubt that most of the Eastern European members of NATO, the exceptions, of course, being Hungary and Slovakia, understand how dangerous a Putin victory in Ukraine would be for them. They've been sounding the alarm about Russian aggression since it began in 2014, when leaders in Germany and France were nonchalant and basically unaware of the dangers. So they understand this because their independence could very much be on the line. And having lived under the Russian boot, not just in Soviet times, but before, they don't want to return to that. So they get it. But it's leaders further west that have not fully understood it. And again, we have very timid leadership coming from Washington, and less important, but also important, even more timid leadership in Berlin.
Interesting. Looks like it would be remiss of us, whilst we have you, to not ask you about the situation in the Middle East. I hope you don't mind the slight pivot here, but you were also US Consul General in Jerusalem at some point in your career. So I want to ask you how you assess the current situation in Lebanon and Gaza and Israel's strategy there.
Israel is doing very important and positive things right now in severely diminishing Hezbollah's military capability and demonstrating that the aggressive authoritarians can be beaten. The Russians are not the only ones we need to worry about globally. We have to worry about the Chinese. We have to worry about the North Koreans and the Iranians. And they've been working ever more closely together. We, the United States, have not enabled Ukraine to win this war. And we could if the White House was not so timid. But Israel, despite Washington's urgings not to do this, is proceeding with delivering a heavy blow, not just to Hezbollah, but also to Iran. And that's a very good thing. And the problems that Israel is creating for Iran may mean that Iran's not going to be able to send nearly as many drones and missiles to Russia to destroy the electricity grid in Ukraine and to kill Ukrainian civilians. And that's also a good thing. But American timidity is even greater in the Middle East than it is in Europe because, the Iranian proxies have been sending missiles against not just international shipping, but our shipping, our Navy in the Red Sea. Iranian proxies have launched hundreds of attacks on American soldiers stationed in the northern Levant. And as we all know, 3 soldiers died in one of those attacks a few months ago. And after that attack, we struck back moderately hard, only moderately. If we had struck back hard against the first attacks, perhaps those soldiers would be alive today. And there, too, the Biden administration obsesses about quote-unquote escalation. It does not seem to realize that weakness is more likely to provoke escalation than strength.
Really interesting getting your view on that, particularly the way as it pertains to the relationship between Iran and Russia. But I just want to pick up on your earlier point you made in that answer, which was that Israel's it's acting as it wants now. It's not waiting for permission from the US. Did you think during your time there that now we would see this point where Israel is behaving as it sees fit, regardless of global concerns or global criticism?
Well, I worked on and in the Middle East for a good portion of my career. And the pattern we're seeing today is not new. Basically, when Israel would be at war, usually because it had been attacked, we would say fine at the beginning. We, the United States, would say fine at the beginning. And then at a certain point, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks into the war, we would say, well, maybe Israel's now time to calm down. And they would usually not calm down, in other words, not desist for a while past our urgings, and then eventually they would stop. This time, so it fits an old pattern, but I suspect because the caution in the White House is greater today, and the need for Israel to strike decisively is greater today, the period before Israel decides to listen to our caution will be longer this time.
Really interesting. And you mentioned also that you believe that Israel's, if they achieve a decimation of Hezbollah, would be beneficial, of course, as you said. I hope I'm not misquoting you here, to US, to others in the world as well. But do you think they
can... There's no doubt about it.
Do you think they can satisfy those aims?
I think they've already largely incapacitated Hezbollah. Not completely. They will not be able to destroy it completely. But what they've done to thousands of Hezbollah fighters and to not just the old Hezbollah leadership, Nasrallah, who was in power for over 30 years, but the guys who replaced him, is crushing. And it will take Hezbollah years to recover, if ever.
It's been really fascinating speaking to you. Thank you for your time, former US Ambassador to Ukraine and now Senior Director at the Atlantic Council, John Herbst.
Thank you. My pleasure.
That is all we have time for on Global News Today. Thank you for watching and be sure to join us tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Bangkok. It's the city of angels and the Venice of the East. Bangkok is one of the most visited cities in Southeast Asia. Thailand's capital city brings hundreds of thousands of visitors from all over the world each year. The largest and most developed city in Thailand, Bangkok offers tourists a mix of modern and upscale sights and sounds while maintaining its old charm from its historical architecture and traditions that date back to hundreds of years. One of the most famous is Wat Arun, located on the west bank of Chao Phraya River opposite the Grand Palace. This is a must-see site in Bangkok, as the architectural design is completely unique to that of other temples in Thailand's capital. You can even climb its steep 70-meter high spire, which boasts the best views of Bangkok's skyline. While it is also known as the Temple of Dawn, Wat Arun is best at night when lit up, as it gives off a golden beam of light over the Chao Phraya River. The Grand Palace is the capital's most glorified and world-renowned structure. It was once the home of the Thai king, the royal court, and the administrative seat of government, and was built back in 1782. Marvel at its ancient designs, from the diverse array of Buddhist sculptures and temples that flow through the vicinity. Most popular is the Wat Prakil, or the Temple of the Emerald Buddha. Bangkok is also well known for its busy market scene. Anchored on either side of the river are boats stocked with fresh tropical fruits and veggies, coconut juice, and local food being cooked on open grills. Also popular are the floating markets Damnon Sadwak, Ampawa, and Klong Lat Mayong. Likewise, Bangkok's mall scene is alive and kicking, with enough shops stretching from Siam along Sukhumvit Road to last a lifetime. Also within Bangkok's cosmopolitan urban jungle are the expert tailors that can be seen on almost every street. You can get a tailor-made suit together for just about a week or two at a very reasonable price. Despite the city's known busyness, Bangkok also offers experiences for rest and recluse. Massage parlors can be found all over Bangkok, offering a Thai oil massage, head, neck and back massage, foot massage, and many more. One can also opt for a nature respite from the sprawling concrete jungle nearby within the city. It is known for its lush tropical trees, lakes, and raised embankments that pass unique houses on stilts built along the Chao Phraya River's edge.
From the blackness of this liquid, the Arabs of ancient times wrote down their letters, and they were messages of light to the world. They occupy an important position in Arab culture during the eras before Islam and the ones that came after the advent of it. Ancient civilizations knew and used the color black, and they have been using it since as far back as 5,000 years ago. And they used it to create tangible records of human memory. Ink. It is the primary tool for the art of calligraphy. Rather, it is more appropriate to label it as calligraphy itself. The chemical industries developed due to the scientific heritage of the Arabs. There are many books and journals written regarding this industry that is known as alchemy. It contains a mixture of magic and astrology and mysterious symbolic phrases that obscure the clarity and quality of the text. We have obtained knowledge of these concepts and messages imbued from past heritage. They contain information regarding the manufacturing of writing materials, pharmaceuticals, perfumes, crafting military instruments, jewels, metals, coin minting, and magical games. Among these books were works that contain more than one of the discussed chemical industries, including information on how to manufacture various types of ink and midad. A pound of crushed tannins were taken and thrown into a pot with 3 pounds of water and placed over a simmering heat. From time to time, a small amount was taken out, and they would try to write with it until the color of the text would become red. That would indicate that it was ready. Then, they would add 3 ounces of Arabic gum. and an ounce of zaj, also known as vitriol. It would then be strained into a new container, and it would be considered prepared for writing purposes. As for paper, they would use specialized ink, and it was smoked ink. It is known for its long manufacturing process that can take up to 10 days. A pound of crushed tannins from the Levant would be soaked in 6 pounds of water with a small amount of myrtle for a week. It was boiled on a fire until it simmers down to half or 2/3 of its volume. It was then filtered through a piece of cloth and left for 3 days. The filtered solution was then weighed, and then for every pound of it, an ounce of Arabic gum and zaj would be added to it. To give the solution its distinct black color, they would add soot to it. After being kneaded by hand with plant sugar, saffron, and copper rust, which is referred to as patina, until it adequately crushed. For every pound of ink, 1/3 of an ounce of soot would be added. The only ingredient left is aloe, which is known for its bitterness and helping keep flies off of the solution. To make sure the ink is preserved for a long period of time, they would add honey to it. Thus, each type of writing had an ink assigned to it. What the ink maker is doing throughout this is preparing a special type of ink that was used during times of travel and during journeys, which Arabs were known to embark on quite frequently. So they invented a type of ink, which was referred to as cold ink, as it did not need fire to be used. It was made of crushed tannins that had 3 grams of zaj added to each ounce of it, along with 3 grams of Arabic gum. When they wanted to write using it, they would add a sufficient amount of water to the previously prepared mixture, and it would be ready to be used. Whatever type of ink it may be, they have to be categorized based on several conditions. The first of which is that it must flow quickly from the pen without it seeping to the other side of the surface of the paper. It should not be in the form of a gel or powder that would leak inside of the pen case. It must also be dark enough to be easily seen if used on papers that were of darker shades. It must dry quickly while setting on the paper without being affected by water. Finally, its color should not fade with the passage of time. Other colors of midad were known, such as green, blue, silver, and gray. It was used in landscape paintings, and sometimes it was used in writing. The blue ink was made from metallic compounds and Arabic gum, and it is an iron gall ink. However, it is different than older iron inks. As for the green ink, it was prepared from patina, brass, saffron, Indian indigo, and Arabic gum. There are also other types of midad that are red and red ink. The most famous material used in the manufacturing of red ink were patinas and copper shavings. One of the researchers named Laurie examined the red ink present on an ancient Egyptian tablet that dated back to 400 BC. He found that it consisted of red ochre, which is a mixture of natural components, with ferric oxide being its main component. Colors were used to decorate manuscripts. As for red midad, and it was present in manuscripts from the pre-Islamic era to highlight elements of the texts, such as titles and chapter dividers. Its use continued after the advent of Islam. It even benefited researchers in revealing the date of copies of the Quran through the use of the red ink. It was used to decorate the beginning of surahs. It would later become used in the first forms of diacritical marks. Green and yellow inks would eventually be added to them. When we open a manuscript and see the colors that it contains that differ from black, we must not allow the experience to just pass us by. Rather, we must stand proud as we witness the creativity that reflected the intelligence and development of Arab sciences